And welcome to the second meeting in 2014 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. Could I please, first of all, remind everyone to turn off any mobile phones or other electronic devices. Michael's not here, but we have not yet received any apologies, so he may be running late. The first item on our agenda today is to take evidence on the Early Years Change Fund for the Minister for Children and Young People, who is accompanied by the Chief Medical Officer and by two Scottish officials. I therefore would like to welcome to the meeting Aileen Campbell, Sir Harry Burns, Shirley Lang and Philip Rains. I understand that the Minister would like to make a brief opening statement.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Convener. On behalf of the Early Years Task Force, I would like to thank you for inviting us here today to discuss the progress of the Early Years Change Fund. And as co-chairs of the Task Force, Sir Harry Burns and I are here to represent the views of the Task Force. Unfortunately, our local government co-chair, Councillor Chapman, is unable to attend today and sends his apologies. The Early Years Framework signified an important milestone in encouraging partnership working to deliver a shared commitment to giving children the best start in life and to improving the life chances of children, young people and families at risk. The Early Years Task Force shares that commitment. Established in November 2011, the Early Years Task Force role is to develop the strategic direction for the Early Years Change Programme and to coordinate policy across government and the wider public sector to ensure that early years spending is prioritised by the whole public sector. In setting out its visions and priorities in March 2012, the Task Force made clear that the establishment of the Early Years Change Fund signified a significant shift to preventative spend over the current parliamentary term. That's because the Early Years Change Fund is the first time we have collectively discussed a financial mechanism for delivering on the aspirations of the Early Years Framework. £2.7 billion is spent by the public sector each year on children in their early years, and the Change Fund presents a huge opportunity and a good starting point to fulfil the Scottish Government, local government and NHS Scotland's joint intention to shift the resource to where it makes the most difference by supporting prevention and early intervention. The clear expectation set out by Task Force was that through the Early Years Change Fund, partners will consider how they can better support universal services to deliver better for children in their early years and their families, raise public awareness of the significance of the early years to children's healthy development and bring the totality of their resources to discussion on how best to deliver the aspirations of the Early Years Framework. And we know that from the outset the Early Years Change Fund has had an impact. For example, Angus have told us in their Year 1 Change Fund return of their plans to integrate education, early year services and social work family support services to provide locally based early intervention and prevention teams. But that's just one example. Returns from all CPPs have been overwhelmingly positive, providing us with strong evidence of a move towards prevention and early intervention. The Early Years Task Force always viewed the Change Fund as a good first step to achieving the longer-term goals by prevention and transformational change in service delivery. By its very nature, being a change fund, its lifespan was designed to be limited. The funding commitments from health and local government will end in 2014-15. The Scottish Government has committed £8.5 million to the Early Years Change Fund for 15-16 to support the transition away from the Change Fund model. The impact and legacy of the fund will continue, however. It, together with the wider network of the Task Force, has enabled the development and the establishment of the Early Years Collaborative. The Early Years Collaborative is the world's first multi-agency quality improvement programme and provides us with the method that will continue to see the Scottish Government, health and local government embed prevention and improvement at a local level going forward. Delivered at a national scale, this locally based work is helping us collectively bridge the gap between what we know works and what we do using improvement science to improve outcomes for our children and families. The ambition of the Early Years Collaborative is nothing short of making Scotland the best place in the world to grow up. All 32 CPPs in Scotland have embraced this approach and are actively looking to build on the good things they already do and to learn from others in order to improve the outcomes for Scotland's children in terms of stillbirth, infant mortality and reaching development milestones. It's early days for this groundbreaking work, but already we're starting to see small changes having an impact. So to conclude, Convener, the Early Years Task Force made clear in March 2012 that its aim is to put Scotland squarely on course to shifting the balance of public services towards early intervention and prevention by 2016 and to sustain this change to 2018 and beyond. The Early Years Change Fund has got us off to a good start and the Early Years Collaborative provides us with a way forward, acting as it does as a vehicle for embedding this prevention and improvement. So thank you very much, Convener, for allowing me to make those opening remarks and of course we stand ready to answer any questions that I'm sure you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. As you're probably aware, the way this committee works is that I'll ask a few initial questions, then I'll open up the session to colleagues round the table. I found your introductory speech very interesting, and you kind of answered one of the questions in part that I was going to start with, which was basically about further money being allocated to the change fund from health and local government budget. And you've pointed out that's not going to be the case. But in 2014-15, we'll see £99.25 million coming from the Scottish Government, health and local government into the fund, but that will fall dramatically to only £8.5 million from the Scottish Government. So what impact is that likely to have in terms of delivery?
Well, as I said, the Change Fund was a mechanism by which we would establish that culture of change and encouraging people to sit around the tables at the 32 different CPPs in order to bring to the table the totality of the resources to help improve lives for children in their earliest years. The 8.5 million you refer to is about it will be a transition away from the Change Fund into ensuring that changed behaviour can then be embedded further. But of course, the method by which we're delivering the change is the Early Years Collaborative, which is taken much of what we want to see in terms of improvement of children's lives, that early intervention and prevention of problems before they arrive. The Early Years Collaborative will be the legacy of the Change Fund moving forward with change behaviour, ensuring that improvement science is the way in which we analyse the changes that have been affected by the improved service delivery. So the Early Years Collaborative, will be the lasting legacy of the Change Fund and the task force. But the 8.5 there is designed to be the transition away from the Change Fund model, because it was only designed to be limited in its lifespan.
I fully appreciate that, but I mean, is there evidence that it has fully delivered such that we can actually downsize the funds available to such a large extent over a one-year period?
Well, like I say, the Early Years Change Fund was designed to be limited in its lifespan and has already demonstrated some very good examples of prevention in action, and the collaborative moving forward will take forward a lot of that work. But the Scottish Government's money, the 50 million, was new money, and that 8.5 is that transition away from the Change Fund model into embedding some of the changes that we have expected to see through the work of the task force and the Change Fund.
Can you tell us a wee bit more? You've already touched on the Early Years Collaborative. Can you tell me how the Early Years Collaborative, how the Early Years Change Fund impacts on that, and what you're expecting it to deliver in that specific area?
Yeah, I mean, I'll pass on to Harry Burns to talk generally about the collaborative, but certainly the delivery model for this changing from a deficit model to building on assets, to improving children's lives, to preventing problems before crises develop, has been through the improvement science and through the collaborative, and it has reaped real rewards already. It's improving the way we work with children and families in their earliest years, and it has been overseen by the task force. The task force has been overseeing the Change Fund and has paved the way to set the collaborative up in Scotland, which is world leading. But to go into more specifics around the collaborative, Harry will be able to talk more fully about that.
Would it be helpful for me to describe what a collaborative is and how it's working?
Certainly would.
There's a lot of evidence, international evidence that's been going back for maybe 40 odd years, that early intervention transforms life chances. It doesn't just improve health, but it improves educational attainment, it improves employability, it reduces offending behaviour. And a lot of that evidence actually comes from the United States. In the 1960s, President Johnson was a huge social reforming agenda that delivered a lot of early years interventions. And a few years ago, we got a fellowship for a public health doctor to go and spend a year at Harvard reviewing that evidence. They came back with a very convincing set of interventions that had been evaluated by economists, the Bell Prize-winning economists, and showed that the longer you left these interventions running, the bigger the return on investment. So that The real returns began to appear when the children who'd experienced those early years interventions hit mid-teens. By then, they were succeeding at school. They hadn't had serious illness, often as a result of violence in American inner city communities, and they were not getting involved in offending behaviour. As that has gone on, we're now looking at returns of investment after 30, 40 years of about $50, $60 for every dollar spent on an early intervention. At the same time, a range of new scientific studies showed the importance of supportive, nurturing environments in creating attachment behaviour, and that explained why these early interventions were so successful in a social sense. What we lacked was a method for implementing those changes, because the typical way in which government historically, all governments have historically done change, is they've come up with a 3-year project. Let's have a project, let's fund it for 3 years, we'll see what happens, and usually when the money runs out, the project dies. And to be honest, I think we're all fed up with that, good ideas that have flourished and then faded away. We decided that we needed a method that would last, that it would be done at scale, it would be a whole Scotland set of interventions, and it would be one that would engage the front line. Again, typically the great and the good get together and they write a report and it gets published and ministers say, yes, we'll all go and do this. But if the front line is not involved in shaping what those interventions are, their sense of ownership maybe isn't as good as it should be, and take-up is patchy. The collaborative methodology brings together the front line, and the front line staff working with parents, working with voluntary agencies and so on, help shape what the interventions are and how they will be delivered. What we do is we say to them, well, we actually need to help parents who don't know how to be parents attach to their children and nurture their children and do the kind of things for their children that we know will prepare them from school. So across Scotland, all CPPs come together every 4 or 5 months, and they say what they've done to do that. For example, reading bedtime stories for children, help improve their vocabulary, their speech, their learning, etc. We can tell you how many children most nights of the week get a bedtime story, and we can tell you the CPPs where that's above 90%, because they're testing it. They go out and they do it, they do things, they give parents aid memoirs, they give parents books, they give them reading, and they measure. The next day they come in and say, how many of you guys had a bedtime story last night? And they measure it, and there's constant change. And then they come together and they share their experience so that the learning is spread. And over a period of years, and it doesn't happen overnight that we get the change at scale, but over a period of maybe 2 or 3 years, we begin to see the successes, the things that work, being shared across the whole of Scotland, and they become embedded in what we do. So this is a change behaviour programme that will embed good practice across the whole of Scotland as quickly as we possibly can do. And we've learned from the patient safety programme, which has been staggeringly successful. I would not have believed how successful patient safety programme using the same methodology has been in transforming the quality and safety of healthcare in Scotland. And we have very hard data after 5 or 6 years as to how things have improved. It will take 5 or 6 years to be able to see this. We have committed to, one of the aims of the Early Years Collaborative has been to reduce infant mortality by 15% by 2015. If we reduce it by 15%, we're down at the same level as the Scandinavian countries. We're already the lowest infant mortality of the 4 UK countries. We will get down to levels similar to Sweden and places like that if we achieve those aims. And there's maybe just a wee sense that that's beginning to happen. I wouldn't want to sort of promise anything yet, but actually we're beginning to see things in small pockets, and they'll be scaled up. So it's reorientating how the public sector, working with voluntary agencies and with government, is doing things. And it's a process that's in train, and it's a process that's really been only active for a year. It's early days yet.
Will Early days, as you said, and you said it doesn't happen overnight, and you want to involve the front line. But in the evidence that the Finance Committee took in terms of the draft budget, we had some concerns that the delivery was actually quite patchy across Scotland, despite what you've said about the CPPs. And I'm just wondering, I mean, this is all in a report, as you're probably aware, but I'm just wondering, you know, what the government intends to do, to try and remove the barriers that still exist in terms of cultural and structural changes, and what you're going to do to address those.
Patchiness is absolutely what we'd expect. The whole point is that we don't dictate to people what local circumstances require them to do. They will develop things, and you will get different parts of Scotland developing different aspects of the change at different rates. But they will come together. You get successes, you know, Lothian will do something very successfully. It will do other things less successfully. Perth and Kinross will do things very successfully and other things less successfully. And they'll come together and say, how did you do that? Okay, we'll do that now. And you will get, the patchiness will disappear as the collaborative matures. It will take 2 or 3 years for that to happen. There's nothing unexpected about this at this stage. The kind of barriers you talk about, however, attitudinal and cultural barriers within public sector organisations, like who are they to come and tell us what to do? The collaborative is designed to avoid that because their local staff are out there testing and measuring what works. It's not a smart aleck like a chief medical officer coming to tell them what to do. It's their staff saying, hey, we've tried this and it works. So the culture change is what the collaborative seeks to try and overcome. But it doesn't happen overnight. But it's the best way to deliver this. Sorry.
Let it get myself a word in.
And of course, the collaborative is existing, and is the momentum behind it is incredible to see. And of course, it doesn't, because it's, even though it's a national approach, that means that it's respectful of the local approaches that will be taken forward, improvement that we expect. But aside from that and the Change Fund and the earlier task force, the legislative programme that we have that accompanies the wider government's public sector reform is the Children and Young People Bill, which will be embedding a degree of consistency in how we approach children's services. So by putting GIRFEC, elements of GIRFEC on a statutory footing, that should help some of that consistency, but is still respectful of the different local approaches that each local authority will want to take, and how they best tackle issues around children's services and dealing with children and young people and their families. So aside from the collaborative, there is the work that we're doing legislatively to try in ensuring that every young person across Scotland gets access to services that are much more coordinated and joined up in the way that we've seen. Perhaps, we would point to the example in Highlands of the Pathfinder programme that they used there, and how we can make sure that that's this case for many more children right across the country. So we've got legislative tools as well, and also within the collaborative there's the leadership strand of the early years collaborative, because we need to have leaders taking forward that message as well. But of course, it's being informed also by the good work, the fantastic work that frontline practitioners are doing.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm only going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to allow colleagues to come in, because I think colleagues want to explore some of these issues in greater depth. Just to go back to a draft report, in terms of the budget, the committee asks what progress has been made in developing a monitoring and evaluation framework for the Early Years Change Fund, as stated in January 2012, and when such an evaluation report will be published.
Well, we did our own. We asked each local authorities to provide some returns on what the activities they've been doing just now, and that had been taken forward by a subgroup within the Early Years Task Force, headed up by David Martin, the Chief Executive of Rainfreshire Council, who's a member of the task force. And within those returns, we have some examples and a clear demonstration of the work that CPPs are doing to try and live up to the aspirations we all have within the Early Years task force. So that's been a first stab, and it's been a learning process in itself. And of course, as we move forward, we'll be able to be more sophisticated in how we kind of get back some of the information that will require us to look and see how effective this has been. But as a first attempt. It certainly has shown that each local authority is committed to this agenda, and each CPP is committed to this agenda along with their other partners, which include the third sector. So that, I think, is available publicly if the committee want to see that.
Yeah, because I think it's important, monitoring and evaluation. I think it's important if we're going to eliminate some of the patchiness, we need to know that there's the way progress has been evaluated is there's a degree of commonality across the country. Okay, I'm now going to open up the session, and the first person to ask a question will be Jamie, to be followed by Jean.
Thank you, Convener. And in the paper the government provided for us, and the Minister emphasised this point again in her opening remarks, the paper says the Change Fund is the first time we have collectively discussed a financial mechanism for delivering on the aspirations of the early years framework. And I thought, given that point was made both in the paper and by the Minister in her opening remarks, I wonder if it might be helpful to know what the position was previously, what was happening before this approach was taken.
Well, I think the task force and the Change Fund, it's about bringing people around the table together and people bringing the totality of the resources to the table. Now, the early years Change Fund was about a first start and a first step towards transforming how we kind of use that money and to get the maximum benefit to enable children and families to have the best possible outcomes that they can. So it's always been about this changing culture to stop the silo mentality. So the CPPs brought people together, but the task force at that higher level has meant that we can talk about how we do shift the resource and how we can try and make that first attempt towards ensuring that the money that we use in the earliest years is used to get the maximum benefit. And of course then now, because the Early Years Change Fund is funding the collaborative, that is now significantly changing, as we've heard from Harry Burns there, the approaches that local authorities are taking around the country, and that sharing of that information in a very safe place to learn from one another, even if there have been things that haven't worked out. That provides learning as well. So this has been a first steps towards that change in how we approach using our finances in the early years, and the collaborative has been funded and will then move further transformation forward.
For the Change Fund and this new approach, was there little evidence of that type of collective working, or was it sort of patchy across the country?
I think it would probably be, I think it probably wouldn't be to that same level of consistency. There would be always good pockets of practice around the country, but it's about now how do we make that the rule rather than the exception, and the task force bringing together the key players, not only from local government or health, but from the third sector, parents as well, a whole range of different people around the table to sort of again provide that monitoring as well about how some of these resources are spent. But the Change Fund has now funded the collaborative, and that will again further embed that collaborative work in, because I don't think the public see public money as being health money or local authority money. They just want to have good services. So this is about making sure that can happen in the best possible way, because resources are tight at the moment, so we need to get the best use of what we have there. And there's quite a considerable amount of money used in early years, 2.7 billion, so it's about 10 times the amount that we have within the Change Fund. So how do we use that to get the maximum impact and maximum benefit? The key is to making sure that we have prevention as our hallmark, as Harry has outlined. That's the best use of money, is to make sure that we have good outcomes later on in life, because if you spend early, you can prevent some of the problems, the persistent social problems that we see from happening.
Yeah, I mean, you referred to the £2.7 billion, which is set out in the paper. I suppose we're focusing on the Change Fund, which is a lot smaller, but in terms of the work of the collaborative and the task force and so on, you're very much looking then at this as a more holistic, this is the whole pot of money that you're looking at rather than just the Change Fund itself. And
again, it's important to recognise that the key players that we're talking about there hadn't sat around the table together before the task force had started. So of course one of your members in the committee here sits on the task force as well, so it has that kind of cross-party political representation too. So it's about, again, making the best use of the money that we have, and the task force and the Change Fund have given us the mechanism by which we can do that. Sorry, Harry, you want to...
Just a point about, is this better than the old way? As someone who worked in health boards for a decade and so on, the old way was intensely frustrating, because the typical way of trying things out was a call for bids, and 5 or 6 health boards or whatever would be successful. They'd go off and they'd do things. They'd get 3 months funding, and then when the funding ran out, the thing stopped because it wasn't being embedded in practice. And the extent to which there was cross-country learning from these projects was limited by the extent to which people shouted about it. You know, we do suffer a bit from the not invented here syndrome. That, you know, if Edinburgh did something successful, well, would Glasgow pick it up? Maybe, maybe not. That kind of problem. Whereas the collaborative, there's a continual quality improvement and sharing of successes, and it just becomes the way we do things around here. So it's been a big transformation, and it's one that's attracting quite a lot of international attention, because as far as I can tell, we're the first people to have applied the collaborative methodology to something other than health care. And that's attracting, as I say, quite a lot of attention.
The paper the government provided also talks about the objectives of the Joint Early Years Change programme and the work of the collaborative, and there's 3 specific bullet points. Talks about delivering tangible improvement in outcomes and reducing inequalities for Scotland's vulnerable children, putting Scotland squarely on course to shifting the balance of public services towards early intervention and prevention by 2016, and sustaining this change to 2018 and beyond. And notwithstanding, I totally accept the point made by the Chief Medical Officer in terms of it being many years hence before you can maybe see some of the changes. Although you did say you had a wee sense of some changes. You asked us not to hold you to that, so I'm just wondering if you could set out what the progress is insofar as it's possible to assess the progress to achieving those 3 outcomes.
Well, again, you know, there's been the culture change, not least the culture change by which the task force has allowed us to get together to make sure that we are working holistically to improve children's services, but there are, within the returns from the community plan and partnerships, already indications that local authorities are changing the way in which they do business. We've got, for instance, like I said, I gave the example of Angus that are integrating their, the education with social work for the early years. We have West Lothian has a preventative intervention board. Highland Council have allocated an additional 2 million recurring for early years services, 1 million in each of 2013, 14, 14, 50, and that work's taking place to identify further preventative spend across partners. So within that, the returns, which is available online, you know, should the committee wish to look at it, there is already clear examples from each local authority who have given us the returns that they are doing things differently, and again that lives up to the aspirations that we set about making sure that that's put on a sustainable footing beyond 2016 and 18. Harry, do you want to?
The high-level outcomes that Scotland has agreed on: reduce infant mortality by 15%, reduce the number of children with developmental delay at the 30-month assessment, and reduce the number of children with developmental delay when they reach school. Now, underneath those high-level outcomes, there are a whole set of processes that we have evidence that, if we do them at scale, will deliver those outcomes. So what we've got just now is evidence of process change. For example, nurturing behaviour through things like the Family Nurse Partnership that's spreading around Scotland, things like reading to children, things like Healthy Start vitamins and all these kind of things, nutrition and so on. We can see processes changing, but the high-level outcomes, it's a bit like winning an Olympic medal. As Chris Hoy said, the British cycling team won all those Olympic medals through the accumulation of small gains across lots of different areas. You know, the small gains added up to big change. What we're doing is we're seeing small changes across hundreds of different processes involved in early years that will ultimately produce those big changes that we're aiming for.
You can sort of see a change in culture and process, but it's too early really to see a change in outcomes. Returning to the answer that the Minister gave a minute ago about the local examples, I mean, one of the things the committee asked was for evidence of additional resources which the Change Fund had leverage in within local authorities. So presumably that is the answer, and this is these examples you've given, which you say are publicly available, are the evidence that is happening. Yeah,
absolutely. And then of course there's other things that the Family Fund within the Change Fund has levered in big lottery funding as well to make that total pot larger. So that's again leveraging in money from not just the local authorities or health, but from the third sector as well. And even within the returns, local authorities have pointed to funding from the third sector to help deliver some of these local projects that they are working on as well. So, yeah, beyond the funding within the kind of local authorities and health boards, there is additional funding that we can point to as well because of this changed approach, this changed culture, and everyone's recognition that the best way to spend the money that we're talking about is in prevention.
Typically, what we will see is backfill. You know, when health visitors become get involved with the family nurse partnership, their job as health visitors working with GPs and so on will be backfilled. So there's that's where a lot of the stuff is coming, where people pick up new roles and new tasks and so on to give them time to do that. Other funding is being made available to backfill the space that they have left in their traditional roles. It's about reorientating how we're delivering services.
I just have one final question I'm making. You know, we also saw an announcement last week in relation to free school meals for primary 1 to primary 3-year-olds, and I'm just wondering how that fits in with this whole area. And could that also be viewed as part of the early intervention and also the preventative spend again is something this committee's taken a real interest in? And again, you know, will this be measurable? Will we be able to see a change in outcomes for these youngsters?
You know, the early years goes beyond preschool, goes up to the age of 8, and to reflect that there is a new work stream which will be looking at how we can improve life chances for children in that cohort. So absolutely, I think the free school meals thing, once we kind of can examine that, will have an impact on those children at those ages, because we know that it helps with their health and well-being. We know it helps with attainment, because they can learn much more ably if they're not feeling hungry and they're not worried about that in their life. So absolutely, I would imagine that will have a positive impact in terms of the collaborative work that we're taking forward as well. But that is a new work stream as well that we're moving forward with.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Jean, to be followed by John.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask about the end of the Change Fund and the proposal, Minister, that you say that by that time, hopefully the frontline services who are delivering will be working in a new culture, if you like, and that will be that. But that's not reflected, in a sense, in the report that we have of local authorities being, I guess, nervous of the end of the fund, and perhaps their understanding of what the change means. And some of the reading of that sounds as though it's a kind of add-on instead of making a change, that when that funding is withdrawn, that service will stop. So that's just one question. And also the task force, will that continue after the end of the funding? Will the task force, is there still, what kind of monitoring or evaluation will that simply be, as Sir Harry Burns said, that our infant mortality rates are moving towards Swedish rates, which is fantastic. How will the measurement look in a practical terms to you? How will we have the confidence that the change has been made?
Well, in terms of the early years change fund, I said that the 50, approximately £50 million there is of new money, is government money, and it's that'll come to the end. The 8.5 million will be the transition away from the change fund. It was only ever designed to be limited in its lifespan to bring about the change in culture that we expect. The funding from local authorities and NHS was bringing their resource to the table too, but that remains in place as well going forward. So the changes that will have happened through the Change Fund, we expect will still be, that culture will remain, and that 8.5 million will be helpful in terms of that transition. So that hopefully answers some of your question that you mentioned. The Early Years Task Force has been reviewed. We have refreshed it just quite recently, not least to reflect the fact that there's this new work stream going into up to the age of 8. So we've got now, for instance, Bill Maxwell from Education Scotland there to take forward the work that will be happening in schools, for instance, because of that new age group. And we'll again look to review that thereafter following the kind of the changes within the Change Fund. So yeah, we've just reviewed it. We will review it again.
In terms of monitoring, there's a whole lot of monitoring goes on all the time anyway. Things like hospital admission rates. One of the unanticipated consequences of the smoking ban was a significant fall in the number of children being admitted with acute asthmatic attacks to hospital, for example, implying that not only did people give up smoking in public places, but they weren't smoking at home when children were present. We monitor these kind of things all the time, and we get a picture of health. Education monitors a number of things. You know, there's a lot of routinely collected data. The challenge is to put it together in ways that give us a picture, a global picture of the way in which performance across a range of dimensions of child well-being is improving in Scotland, and that will continue. And that money's already out there. It's being used to produce routine statistics and so on. So that will continue.
And also there are opportunities, again, going back to the Children and Young People Bill, because that will be requiring local authorities and health boards to prepare reports about how they're jointly planning their services to deal with children and families. So there are opportunities through then the guidance that will accompany that bill to make sure it dovetails onto the work of the collaborative and other parts of other works that's going on across government, whether that's through the Getting It Right for Every Child programme board, the work that we do for looked after children. So there are opportunities to get that work that Sir Harry's spoken about, to make sure that that kind of goes into some of the returns that we get through the plans that are going to have to happen jointly between local authorities and health boards through the Children and Young People Bill coming into effect.
And can I ask you too, it seems, I mean, I think it sounds really quite exciting what might happen from this. I do, it has a huge appeal, and I do know that some of the difficulties in the early days of this with the Highland Health Board, or NHS Highland, and the Highland Council. But the appeal, I think, is the fact that you bring CCPs together. And am I assuming that, therefore, it really could be seen as a grassroots, bottom-up solutions from the people that are at the front line, actually sharing their own experience?
Absolutely. I think, even going back to what the Christie Commission spoke about things being top down, not working with communities, not working with the assets of families as well. This is about the collaborative, about changing that on its head, about being reflective of local environments, about working with people, demonstrating to them what they can do, how you can help them improve their lives. And the CPPs have absolutely bought into that. I mean, the learning sessions that accompany the collaborative, I think we're at fourth in a couple of weeks' time, up to about 700 plus people in the one room at the SECC, talking about how they can collectively change the way they do business to allow the early year to ensure that the early years is prioritised, to ensure that prevention is the hallmark of what they do, to ensure that they kind of embed good local practice and can share that knowledge. That enthusiasm has never stinted or wavered at all through those learning sessions, and it's probably the first time, certainly I wouldn't be dead certain, but I think it's probably the first time you've got that number of people in the one room talking about these things collectively. And of course, because there's one coming up soon, if members wanted to see it for themselves and to get a feel for the change that the collaborative is inspiring right across Scotland, then that's absolutely an invitation we're happy to extend to you. Harry, sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, well, I mean, I tend not to be fazed by public speaking, but the energy in the room is astonishing. The first time I walked in, I thought, wow, 800 people sitting there from every single CPP in Scotland, plus voluntary agencies and so on, and they really wanted to pick this up and run with it. And they're the ones who ultimately are delivering the change, and it will be embedded in their practice. And it really is worth a visit, actually, because you wouldn't have seen anything like this.
And it's probably worth as well to try and get a feel and grasp for some of the tests of change that are happening in your own local areas, and there will be ones in each of your local authorities that you can go and see. One that I have seen, which is quite a good tangible example, is delayed cord clamping that's happening in the midwife-led maternity unit in Montrose, where they delay the point in which they cut the cord between the mother and the child, because that allows some of the blood to go back. I mean, I'm no medical expert, but this is just paraphrasing, but allows the nutrients and whatever to go back into the baby, so that baby is able to then thrive a bit more quickly, and that's what they're testing, that small test of change. And they may, if they can demonstrate that the work, if they can gather the data, then they can then look towards how they might scale these types of things up. So it's about not just looking at what is going on in your areas, but then asking for that data to then demonstrate to you just the impact that it's having on these children's lives.
And just finally, if I may, one of the actions that Finland took in terms of diet was actually having people educate when they switched from dairy to berries as a kind of basic. And I think Scotland has a similar situation. But is that part of this programme too? Because diet is more and more being recognised as such a huge part of health, and
I can hear that Harry's itching to, but I just wanted to add, because I'm from Perthshire, the soft fruit capital, and Clyde Valley as well, the area that I represent, very famous for its soft fruits, and certainly the abundance of local produce that we have was in Scotland. We could look towards the Finnish example, because I think absolutely you point to something that Finland did. They recognised that they had a problem and they used the resource to try and tackle it. But I think Harry was wanting to...
If I can just add to that, in addition to that, I mean, we do see some of the agencies that we're talking about bringing together not actually wouldn't be hailed as promoting healthy eating too much. Well, some of the agencies that are part of the organisations that you need to deliver don't necessarily promote good, even hospital food and so on. I mean, there are still criticisms of that.
Mm-hmm.
Finland's a sore point with me, because the percentage fall in heart disease mortality from the 60s to the 90s in Finland, which they attributed to this change in tax and subsidies on farmers, is exactly the same as the percentage fall in heart disease that occurred in Scotland over the same time. And the Finnish heart disease fall we attribute to a significant fall in male smoking rates and an increased use of new therapies like statins. And actually, it's hard to attribute the fall in heart disease in Finland to the change in diet. But having said that, and the other thing is about the 5 a day, the evidence base for 5 a day actually came from the fruit growers of America. So there's a lot of myth and, around. But having said that, obesity is clearly a very important thing to avoid. The high-fat, high-sugar diet that lots of us have is certainly the driver behind a lot of that. And there is no question that eating more healthily will improve health and well-being. And there's no question, for example, Child Smile, where the children go to breakfast clubs and so on, the impact of Child Smile has been as great as the impact of fluoridation would have been. It's been astonishing, the impact of Child Smile, which is centred around a dietary intervention, namely breakfast clubs. So there's lots we can do, but we need to be thoughtful about what our expected outcomes are around that. But obesity, I'm certainly with you that we need to tackle that significantly.
And I would maybe go back to the points that Jamie Hepburn raised about the importance of the free school meals policy as well, and the opportunity that presents, because there's been a huge kind of improvement in the school meals that we've seen as well, and there's further opportunity to build on that. Thank you.
Okay, John, to be followed by Gavin.
Well, I'm already feeling slightly less guilty that I don't eat 5 portions of fruit a day. So that's
vegetables,
encouraging. Yes, I realise there's marmalade as well. Yes. We've spent quite a lot of time on the Change Fund itself, which is the main focus, which, as I understand it, is a bit of extra money in the short term to try and change attitudes. And we've talked about the way we do things. I'm interested in this area of kind of disinvestment, and are we really shifting, and can we really shift resources from one group to another? Now, I realise, Minister, you're responsible for children and young people, so if we shifted resources from older people to younger people, that would in fact probably kind of boost your budget. But I guess within your area of responsibility too, we want to spend less money on 16-year-olds and more money on 3-year-olds, or that kind of thing. I mean, if I could just refer back to our report that we did, we mentioned this a couple of times because we said the committee is concerned there appears to be a real lack of evidence of the necessary disinvestment taking place to support the shift towards a preventative agenda, and asked the government to provide examples of resources being unlocked for preventative measures. So can you give us any comments on this kind of idea of are we or can we move resources from presumably an older age group to a younger age group?
I think it would. The early years collaborative, absolutely, and we know that if you do spend in the early years, that does pay dividends in later life. I would hesitate, though, to say that that means then we shouldn't spend money on 16-year-olds, because absolutely, I think we should always remember that you can effectively intervene in a young person's life at many different points and to change their life course. So, for instance, last week we announced that we wanted to allow care leavers looked after children to allow them to stay in foster, residential or kinship care up until the age of 21 if they want to, because we know that that in itself can help them go on to lead more positive lives and help them avoid graduating into, for instance, Polmont, where a disproportionately large number of young looked after children end up. So those are things that we are doing there that can prevent some of those negative consequences happening in later life. So that's an example there that you don't just want to always solely concentrate on the early years, but actually we can intervene effectively to prevent problems arising at many different points in a young person's life. Now, the question around disinvestment is a good one, and it's probably a much more tricky one to answer, because what we haven't had is any specific examples through the Change Fund returns about that necessarily happening. But what has happened is that people are working together to talk about how they can achieve their shared priorities at the CPP level or at a task force level to allow them to then pull their resources together to allow that to happen. So what we can do, what we need to do then is maybe try and be a bit more sophisticated in how we kind of tease out some of that, those perhaps potential disinvestments examples through further monitoring of how the Change Fund has worked and how change has happened.
Yeah. If you enhance attachment and nurturing behaviour in early life, you'll have fewer looked after children, you'll have fewer young men in prison. If you think about the demographic issues that are affecting all of Western society, the small base of young productive people and the big base of dependent elderly, actually it's worse than you think, because the small base of young productive people is made even smaller by the fact that maybe 10-20% of them are not contributing. They're not, and not only that, but they're costing society a lot in terms of being looked after. The aim through this Early Years Collaborative will be to broaden the base, and those young people who are not contributing will become the dependent elderly, and you will hear more later about work being done to reduce the burden of dependency in the older. So there are big macroeconomic consequences of this that should not necessarily mean active disinvestment. We just won't be spending the money in looking after children who have lost their way because they've experienced, they haven't experienced adverse events through drug misusing parents or violent parents or whatever. So that's what the American economic evaluation showed. Far more stable families with children growing up to be actively involved in the labour market and not sustaining serious illness.
Right, so if I'm understanding that, we might not see what I think maybe some of us had thought would be that there would be major changes in the way we use resources, say within the health service or whatever. It will be more just changing the way we use them in a particular age group.
It will happen naturally.
Yes.
If we reduce the number of looked after children by 50%, then there will be a natural realignment of spend. I don't think anyone's saying here we're actively going to take money away from areas that we anticipate in future will not need it.
It's just when I hear figures like you said, for every $1 that was spent in the States in the 60s, there's been a saving of 50 or 60. Well, I'm an accountant. I want to see where is that 50 or 60.
It's a return on investment of 50 or 60, that return on investment would be things like increased tax income because people are in employment who wouldn't have been in employment. Return on investment's different from saving.
Right. And so some of that would be saving and some is extra income or whatever.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Because, I mean, we were given a case, I can't remember, somewhere in the States where they actually decided not to build another prison, but to put the resources into children or whatever. And that sounded like a great idea.
Yeah.
But that was like a real saving. But I don't know what they did with the extra prisoners in the meantime, mind you.
Well, I would not be the least bit surprised if 20 years from now we do shut a prison, because the children will not end up, the young people will not end up. I mean, in terms of the review of community planning that has taken place, what I said when asked by them for an opinion was, the Early Years Collaborative will get things started off well. We should have a reducing offending and reoffending collaborative, because the turbulent young parents that end up in prison go back home and create the turbulent early environment. So if we get them on the right track while they're in prison, and then we should be looking at a collaborative to reduce dependency in older people, keep them active and engaged and fit and so on. And all of that added up will transform the quality of life. The Registrar General's report talks about the fact that at the moment there are about 750 people in Scotland over the age of 100. By 2035, he anticipates there will be 8,000 people over the age of 100. You know, we've got to have those 8,000 people out there running half marathons and things like that, okay? So, so that we need to be ambitious about transforming the quality of life and the productivity and the connectedness within society.
Yes, I suppose I'm still a bit puzzled, because the Change Fund is a short-term temporary measure to kind of kickstart something new. And if I understood the Minister correctly, what we're saying is that the resources that have been put into the Change Fund from health and local government and so on will still be there to actually do the work kind of going forward. But, I mean, going forward, do we not actually need to spend more money on 1 to 3 year olds or whatever? Or is it really just all about collaborating and doing it differently? But if we do need to spend more money on the young kids, that money has got to come from older people or teenagers or somewhere, surely.
Like I say, you know, this is about, you know, was kick-starting the change to allow us to make sure that we can bend the spend more effectively in the early years. There's 2.7 billion spent on the early years per annum by from local authorities and health, and how do we use that to maximise the potential that we can achieve if we do things in a better way, outlined by the work of the collaborative and what Harry has said today. So what we're wanting to do is bring about that change, and the Change Fund has allowed that to happen and to kind of move on forward into the collaborative and the work that is happening there.
So you don't think we do need to bring in more resources from somewhere to put more into the early years? It's more about how we do it and rearranging?
Well, I think in the first instance what we're doing is that we're trying to change the way in which we spend, but of course there are other things that are happening around about it, not least, you know, the local authorities have cited welfare reform as being a particular challenge to get around as well. So we're in a climate there where there are other things happening that are needing to be coped with as well. But the fact is that the collaborative is demonstrating results. The fact is that the brain science of a child tells us that we should be doing more in the early years. The fact is that if we know that we can provide nurturing, loving homes for children, caring minus 9 months as well, not just children when they're born, if we can do all these things, then that can set that child on a firm footing into a positive life later on, to then contribute fully to society, to the economy as well, and to then have their own children that can be born into those nurturing zones. So it's this kind of perpetual cycle that can have long-lasting implications for Scotland as a whole, not just socially but economically as well. And that's what we're doing. This is the first steps that we're taking now with the Change Fund and the collaborative, and we are, like we've said already, in the early stages of that and bringing about that transformational change that we want to see.
I think a number of local authorities have said to us that they're using the Change Fund, as we anticipated, as bridging finance. While they reorientate from one pattern of spend to another, there's a bit of double running. And, you know, in the context of £2 and a bit billion, the Change Fund is pretty marginal. And It's designed to provide that bridging. So I think that it's being used for what we anticipate, but as Minister says, there'll be all sorts of unanticipated things in the future. You know, there will be new science, there might be all sorts of social change that will cause bigger problems. It's hard to predict, but at the moment it's behaving as we expected it to be, allowing a reorientation of activity.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. I just want to clarify a bit more on this issue. You talked there about reorientating of activity, but you know, difficult decisions regarding disinvestment will have to be made to ensure preventive spending becomes integral to service delivery. And the Early Years Task Force states in its guidance on the Early Years Change Fund that, and I quote, "The decision to disinvest will be difficult, but if we are to make the shift, we need those decisions that are crucial." So disinvestment is absolutely essential, you know, surely, you know, if we're going to, in challenging financial times, with demographic change, etc., if we're actually going to access the resources we need to put into those areas that will provide the kind of the benefits that we all seek.
But we would hope that that disinvestment would come because CPPs and areas in general have discovered a better way of doing things by nurturing behaviour. You know, the calculation recently was a looked after child, and this was an academic from south of England who produced this report, that a looked after child over the course of several years cost society £2 million on average. You know, how many looked after children do we have to avoid in order to be able to fund this change? It's actually relatively small, I think. But, you know, the aim would be to have every family being a nurturing place and to get to a position where very, very few children end up in that unfortunate position.
The issue of running in parallel that you mentioned earlier on, I mean, you know, have we got the resources to enable us to do that, you know? Because we can't just suddenly, you know, we've got these folk in care just now, whether we like it or not, and we have to fund them. We obviously want to ensure that there are fewer people in future, but where we're actually creating the kind of environment that allows us to have fewer people in care in future, we still have to, you know, that's where the difficulty surely comes.
And we have to see what emerges. The point about the collaborative is, and the point about letting the front line design the change, is that they will come up with things that you can't anticipate. It's emergent thinking. They will find things that with the best will in the world we could never have predicted, and we have to let it run and see how quickly they produce the change. American experience would say it'll be at least a decade before we begin to see the full benefits of reduced spend in dealing with adversity. But they may, you know, we have to let it run and see just exactly how quickly the benefits begin to flow.
It's also just worth pointing out as well, though, that at a CPP level there'll be jointly agreed priorities set out in each of their single outcome agreements as well. So that will need, you know, quite rigorous and robust discussions that they'll have to have at that table about where their priorities will be and where they'll put their spend. And I did cite the example, Angus integrating education, earlier services and family social work, family support. So that integration there is happening there to allow them to move forward in a positive way in Angus, but that will have been a discussion that they'll have had at whatever table to try and find a way to achieve the priorities that they have set themselves to work in tandem with what's going on at the collaborative and what we're expecting them to do through their responsibility to early years.
You mentioned that Angus example twice now. You know,
There's just a for instance. There could be other. We're just trying to.
But I'm just wondering, you know,
I mean,
is that being rolled out across the country, or have you got an example, you know, which is being rolled out across the country as a result of a collaborative?
Sorry, what an example
initiative?
of?
Yeah, one of these initiatives. You know, collaborative. We're talking about earlier on. I was talking about Mr. Burns was talking about eliminating patchiness and, you know, sharing best practice, etc. Have you got an example of how that's working in terms of collaborative now? I mean, that Angus example, for example, is that getting rolled out, or is it just going to?
Well, the collaborative provides a method. Well, the collaborative provides a method by which each learning session, every local authority will be showing their good practice about things that they have done to enable them to help achieve towards the stretch aims that are within the collaborative. But one national rollout example of something that's happened through the Change Fund would be the Family Nurse Partnership. It's getting rolled out across the country, and that will be working in partnership with good parenting programmes within each individual local authority, and at a local level some other work that will be getting done with the third sector. The other thing that we've rolled out is Roots of Empathy, and that had been a decision that had been taken by members of the Task Force for the Change Fund. And Scotland will be the only country that will have seen this rolled out across on a countrywide basis in the world. Now, that will not be for every school, but it will be for every school that will be required, that will be needing that additional assistance. So these are things that we're doing in the earliest years of a child's life to enable us to realise the benefits, social and economic, later on, because they'll have these relationships, the ability to form these relationships and attachments in adult life to allow them then to be good parents and to keep this perpetual positive cycle going and moving forward. So those are two examples of national rollout of good practice that we'll be working with local authorities to allow that to happen. So you'll be doing it in schools in your local authority. So that's the local dimension to this national rollout.
Yeah, I mean, I've already visited a school in my own constituency for Roots of Empathy. Okay, Gavin, to be followed by Michael.
Thanks, Convener. As the change funds were being set up, so not just the early years change funds, but the various change funds, a number of stakeholders gave evidence to this committee saying they were worried that not all of the money would end up going on preventative spend. Are you able to tell us in practice, I mean, a year and a half or so into it, has all of that money gone on preventative spend in your view? Has most of it gone on preventative spend? Is that something that you track and can tell the committee about?
Well, certainly the 50 million that was new money has gone on a number of different projects, and not least I've outlined one, the Roots of Empathy, Play, Talk, Read, all these things that we know work to enable parents to be as good as they can be. The early years Change Fund returns are available online. You can look for some more examples of some of the what local authorities have told us that they're doing in their CPPs to try and bring about the preventative approach that we would seek. But a lot of that will be very much nitty-gritty, but certainly some of the headline findings are within the Change Fund returns that you can look at.
It certainly seems as if it's facilitated preventative spend. As I've already said, some of it might be used to backfill staff who are involved in prevention, development work. And therefore, technically speaking, it's been used in a slightly different way, but it's still facilitating that preventative spend. And it would be, I guess, logged against that.
Okay, I mean, so when you've given some good examples of where it has gone on preventative spend, I just wonder out loud, if we invited those same stakeholders back to give evidence, 2 years down the line, would they be raising the same fears with us, or would they be saying, look, we were worried about it initially, but actually in practice it pretty much has all gone on preventative spend? I'm just wondering, is that something you specifically track?
Like I say, I think we've had the first run at getting some of the feedback from what the local authorities at their CPP level are doing individually about what changes they've done, what changes they've made, how they've approached the Change Fund in their own local area. And we've got some of that information back, but I think it's been a learning exercise in itself, so we probably will need to kind of reflect on what we've been told, what stakeholders have told you, and find out how, when we go further forward in terms of monitoring, what we can do to improve on the information that we get back. But certainly it's been a catalyst for change. It's brought about and enabled the collaborative and other forms of work to make sure that there's more joint work and there's more of a joined up approach, that there's more embracing of the third sector and what they can do to allow us to achieve the aims that we've set out, be it in the framework, in the early years framework, in the early years task force, in the early years change fund. And the bill is another important tool there as well, about bringing that much greater working together in local authorities and health boards across the country.
Moving on then, there was one of the issues that cropped up were the high-level outcomes, which I think you outlined the high-level outcomes and obviously suggested there's a number of processes underneath each of those. Most of the work and most of the analysis, I think you said so far, has looked at the change to processes. But I mean, has any work been done yet? And I accept entirely that it's early days. But has any work been done yet on the high-level outcomes? Are there any even small, you've got anecdotal stuff obviously, but is there any formal measurement of the high level outcomes yet?
Well, there's constant observation of that. You know, that's part of our routine monitoring, which is why we chose the high level outcomes. It was something that we were measuring anyway, so we would see that change. The experts and collaboratives who have seen many in many different settings, but mainly in delivery of healthcare, say that the first 2 or 3 times the learning sets come together, there's intense frustration because they all want to see change now, and it hasn't happened yet, and they're beginning to build it up. We're about to have learning set 4, where we will begin to see, I think, some significant changes being reported. It's far too early to see those high-level outcomes. Literally, the first learning set was January 13, so it's been going for a year, and we would report things like infant mortality a year behind. So we haven't seen that yet, although, no, I really don't want to preempt anything here, but, you know, I'm sort of itching to see those results.
Sure, no. I won't pressure them.
Again, there are good examples probably in your own patch in Lothians, whether that's West Lothian or Edinburgh. One that we've got is that 90% of parents at Tynecastle Nursery sing or say number rhymes and songs with their child at least 3 times a week by the end of 2013. That has been an aim that's been achieved with the morning group, and now that aim, because it's been seen to have been achieved, it's seen to have worked, that's been scaled up to include the afternoon group. So there are the high-level aims, but certainly beneath that, the small tests of change are showing that once you know what works, once you're confident, you can scale it up to benefit far more children. So that, you know, I'm just offering that as a for instance for within your own local area.
Okay, thank you. And just one other area I wanted to look at, you've touched on it already to quite a lot actually, in terms of just the idea of disinvestment, and you've answered a number of questions from the convener and deputy convener on that. In your paper though, paragraph 2, the last sentence, you do. I'll read it. I mean, you basically say that the health and local government money, which is, you know, obviously the lion's share of the money, are a blend of currently allocated and redeployed resources. Looking at redeployed resources, because I still feel we haven't quite got to the bottom of this. There's some great interventions that are now happening, and you've highlighted a number of them. But if those resources have been redeployed, then clearly they must have come from somewhere else. It's not all new money. I think only the Scottish Government slice is new money. So where has that money been redeployed from? And are there interventions that have now been scaled back or ceased because either they don't work at all or they're just not as effective as, say, the collaborative approach? There must have been something scaled back if monies have been redeployed.
Again, it's been, well, I guess it would be for some of the individual local authorities as well to talk about where they have taken a local decision about how they've brought their share of the pot of money to their partners at the CPP level. But certainly, in terms of local government money, that's been a blend of new money and currently deployed money. But beneath that, for the 32 local authorities, that would need to be a question about what they've taken, what they've done at a local level, about how they've come to bring that particular part of their pot to the table, what they have done to redeploy it. But certainly in the returns there, that's the message that we've had. It's been redeployed and it's been maybe additional money as well. But our money is the new money, and Health have also brought to the table the money that is currently deployed, and that they'll be able to, for instance, with the Child Smile, that was one parcel of the money that Health brought to the table, and within that they've allowed now to expand the Child Smile programme and be a bit more to enable more children to benefit from that particular project. So there's a blend of old and new money. Scottish government money is new money, but this is only a small percentage of the larger pot that's spent on children, which is 2.7 billion. So the change fund is you know, it's the actual pot of money that's used in early years is 10 times what we have within the change fund.
And finally, then, just again, forgive me for dwelling on that point, but at this stage you're not sure where it's been redeployed from. You'd have to check with local authorities. Is that a question you're going to ask them to find out?
I think, well, because each local authority has done it in their own way, and it's been a decision that they've taken locally, but what we do know that has been money that may have been new or additional or realigned money, and the returns from the community planning partnership shows some of the examples of what they have done, which is additional. So, for instance, I think I mentioned the Highlands model, which is additional money for additional recurring 2 million for early year services. And that's been allocated from Highland Council for 2013, 14 and 14, 15, and work's taking place to identify further preventative spend across partners. So they're working collaboratively to try and find out where they can leverage in more money, and they're taking that at a local level. But that won't be the same for all the 31 other councils, and it would have to be drilled down further and asked of them what they have done and how they've brought their pot to the table, what they've done to create the pot that they've brought to the table.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Convener. And again, this question is around this area of disinvestment. Sir Harry Burns has mentioned that a lot of the ideas that we're dealing with here are not new. They've been around for a long time. We've also had change funds in different forms. We used to call it pump priming. We've heard it referred to as bridge funding, all sorts of things. These are not new. And previously, the Finance Committee, the last committee here, said that difficult decisions regarding disinvestment will need to be made. And we've taken evidence previously, and there's one example that sticks with me, was from the Director of Social Work, who said that these decisions were being made, had always been made. The difficulty became when leadership was required around budget decisions or political decisions, and that's part of the problem. So in order to avoid deja vu happening all over again, how do we get to a position where, when the decisions have to be made to shift budgets, to redesign services, which all of the practitioners, the clinicians, the frontline staff buy into, but when the decisions come to be made about shifting the resources from one to another to make the changes happen and make the changes viable, that we don't get those decisions made because of short-termism?
Well, yeah, and Harry will speak and has talked about that this is in a long term. This is about avoiding that what's happened in the past, where people have been suffering from projectitis and there's just continually new things springing up and all the rest of it. This is about trying to make sure that there's a longer term approach to dealing and tackling some of these persistent issues that we've got in Scotland. But in terms of taking that leadership role, there is an expectation within the joint work that community planning partners do, and clear expectations on local authorities and NHS and public bodies to be able to sit around the table, share budgets and resources, and to have those discussions at that level, and to deploy those resources in a way that meets the priorities and needs that they have set out, whether that's in their own local priorities or within the single outcome agreements. So those are some of the ways in which we would expect that leadership to take place in terms of sharing the resource and making sure they get the most and maximum from that money that they have. Harry, do you want to?
You would hope that disinvestment decisions would be made by taking money away from things that don't work and putting them into things that work. The whole point about the early years collaborative, the whole point about any collaborative methodology, you've heard the term tests of change. The test of change is finding out what works. You do it to 3 people today. If it works, you do it to 5 tomorrow. If it still works, you go and tell everyone about it. That's it. We're actually doing something here. We're doing something with mothers who smoke, pregnant women who smoke. We're doing something, and what we're doing works. It stops them smoking. So let's put money into that, and let's find the things that we're doing that aren't working, that aren't contributing to this aim of making Scotland the best place in the world for kids to grow up. That's the principle underlying this. The whole point is that although I perfectly understand you want to follow the money, it's actually the time that's money here. It's the money, it's the time that people spend doing things that don't work that will shift. And I would hope, for example, social workers tell me about all the bureaucracy and the form filling and so on that they have to do. Well, maybe they do less of that in order to do more of the things that work. Those are the kind of decisions that will have to be made.
And again, go back to the bill, making the system a bit more slick is one of the reasons for having the bill, to allow people to do what they want to do, which is to support families and to support children. And the way in which we would want to proceed once the bill is enacted is to make sure that the guidance is robust there, to allow people to reduce some of that bureaucracy, to make sure that they are able to freed up to share the information that they need to allow them to help the most vulnerable in society. So, you know, there's a lot of things going on that kind of work that complement the actions of the collaborative, and the bill is one of them.
It's not so much about chasing the money that I'm asking here, or even, and I like your phrase, Minister, about Project Titus. It's not about, you know, looking at a situation and saying, well, you know, this money has been set aside for 3 years and we'll now measure whether it worked or not, and we'll decide whether it goes on. That's not what concerns me. What concerns me is that history is littered with reports, with analysis, with programmes which have been devised with the buy-in of the clinicians, of the service providers, and the decisions that have prevented those from moving forward are decisions of the budget holders, and even, unfortunately, and I'm not pointing the finger at anyone here because every political party is guilty of it, of making short-term decisions to avoid bad headlines or to try and create short-term headlines for their own political benefit. And what we need to get, if we're talking about a cultural change, is not a cultural change within the services, because in my experiences, the clinicians will be the people who are leading these changes, will be the people who are enthusiastic about reform and about development of services. The problem comes when the leadership from those who have the budgets doesn't allow that transformation to take place. And I can see Sir Harry's nodding, so maybe you want to...
That makes a lot of sense to me, because I've lived through that time. But what we will see in the next year or two, I'm confident, is movement in some of these high-level aims. And who would want to reverse that? I mean, I think we have to go on the basis of the evidence here. The other thing is, as I've mentioned, I mean, last week I had 40 international people here in Edinburgh, all involved in a programme to transform. It started off as healthcare. It then became, after we'd spoken to them, health, transforming health. And after that, it became transforming the notion of assets in delivering health. These are academics from all over Europe and North America predominantly, although some from Africa as well. And they have seen in this really the most striking evidence of something that they now have confidence will succeed, and they want to know more about it. They want to come back in 6 months' time and all that kind of stuff. We've managed to strike a chord internationally here, and I would be intensely disappointed, not to say furious, if middle managers in the system took something that has real chance of transforming thousands of lives and dismantled it. And if I get any scent of that, I'll come back and name names. But, you know, it really is something very important that we've got here, and we need to stick with it.
Again, just to try and back that up is the fact that we do have that leadership strand within the Early Years Collaborative to make sure you're getting that buy-in at those top levels, and I think that will go some way to enabling this to continue with the pace that we've seen, to continue with the momentum that we've seen. And again, convener, if any of the committee members want to come along to the collaborative Lex Learning session just to get a feel for just how much goodwill is out there and commitment to this agenda, then I guess that that invitation is open to you and committee members. The 28th and 29th of January is the next one if you would like to come along.
That's certainly something I'll certainly consider. I'd like to thank colleagues around the table for their questions. Malcolm, obviously, because of involvement in the task force, had a self-denying ordinance in terms of asking questions. But before you all decide to pack up, I'm not finished yet. Just hold your horses.
Sorry.
Obviously, I'm concerned that Sir Harry talked about, that there are still projects out there that don't work, that are still being, we're still spending public money on. I mean, and Michael talked about leadership. But we took evidence a couple of years ago from Birmingham City Council, and they said that they've got the leadership there, but sometimes there's real inertia on the ground. And it's because they went to their social work department and they told them that some of the practices in that department had failed over 20 years to produce any positive outcomes whatsoever. But the difficulty was that there was an emotional attachment of the people who'd been delivering what they thought was a positive and effective service. It didn't turn out to be when the outcomes were analysed. So you know, inertia can creep into the system, prevent change at every level. One thing that came out of our evidence was that the change funds are being used to prop up existing service provision, you know, at a time where of financial challenges to mitigate funding pressures, and it's how we actually tackle that. I'm quite keen on hearing, but to go back to one of my initial questions, and this is what I really I want to kind of finish on this kind of issue. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde stated that there was a need that they need breathing space to provide some of the bridging finance that enables them to address issues simultaneously. So that's changing while maintaining existing services. NHS 5 says they need to extend the change funds for another couple of years beyond 2015 to fully deliver the future model of delivery that we all envisage. And this was a view shared by Glasgow City Council, who said that people are changing and we must allow enough time for those changes to be delivered. So the issue really is that, is it appropriate that we are actually ending effectively the kind of involvement of health and local government funding from 2015-16, when so many health boards, for example, local authorities, etc., are saying we actually need a little bit more space if we're going to deliver what the Scottish Government seeks to deliver in this area?
The funding is... the funding's already remains. The new funding that the Scottish Government will tail off in the last part of that 50 million will be the 8.5 million, but the local government and health money is money that they have and they've brought to the table. So that money is there for them to enable them to continue some of the changes that they may have done as a result of the change fund being in place. But so that money is still there for them to enable to move forward on that agenda.
Well, I mean, you know, if you look at the figures in your own submission, you know, the figures from health and local government are £92 million in 14-15, but that'll actually go to zero the following year. So clearly, it's not being specifically allocated for this purpose, though. I think is the issue that I'm trying to make.
Yeah, but that's still money that they still have their resources there to deploy in light of the kind of the evidence that we all have had from the collaborative, in light of the kind of decisions and recommendations from the task force. That money remains with health and local authorities to enable them to continue to have those local discussions at the CPP level, which we would expect them to be doing through joint the discussions that they'll have around sharing resource and budget. So that will enable them to continue to move down, to continue this path. But
given the concerns I've outlined that have been expressed, is there not a concern that there will be a loss of momentum in terms of delivery?
Well, the collaborative remains. The collaborative's not stopping with the change fund of the task force. And like I say, we'll review the task force in another 12 to 18 months' time to think about then the future going forward. But the collaborative, as Harry and others have said, is not a short-term project. This is a long-term approach that will demonstrate long-term benefits as well. And the momentum that we've had so far, I would imagine, will continue, because it is changing lives and it will change lives in the future. So that momentum will continue beyond the lifespan of the change fund.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Are there any further points that you wish to make to committee before we wind up the session?
I don't think so.
Okay, well,
thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much for answering the questions.
Interest. Thank you.
And thank you to members of the committee also. That being the end of this particular session, we'll just have a short recess until 11 o'clock to enable members to have a natural break and have a changeover of witnesses. Folks, I'm now going to reconvene the session, and the second item on our agenda today is to take evidence on the Reshaping Care for Older People Change Fund from the Joint Improvement Team. I therefore like to welcome to the meeting Dr Margaret Wariski, Dr Anne Hendry, Mr Pete Knight and Mr Jerry Power. So a warm welcome to you this morning, and I believe Dr Wariski would like to begin the session with a short opening statement.
Okay, good morning everyone, and on behalf of the Joint Improvement Team I would like to thank you for inviting us here today to discuss the Reshaping Care for Older People Change Fund. Just by way of introduction, the Joint Improvement Team is a strategic improvement partnership between Scottish Government, NHS Scotland, COSLA, the third independent and housing sectors, and we're governed by a Joint Improvement Partnership Board representing those sectors. We work with health, social care and housing partnerships to help create the conditions for implementing national strategies and deliver and sustain improved outcomes for people. The Reshaping Care for Older People, a programme for change that was launched in 2011, sets a 10-year whole system transformation programme that seeks not only to shift the location of care from institutional to community, but also to transform the culture and philosophy of care from reactive services provided to people towards preventative, anticipatory and coordinated care and support at home delivered with people. The £230 million invested so far through the Change Fund has provided partnerships with additional resources and capacity to progress with the policy goals and outcomes to enable older people remain independent as possible and be able to live in their own home or in local community settings for as long as possible and for as long as they wish to. The Change Fund is a catalyst to enable partnerships to accelerate local progress and develop plans to drive sustainable improvements through greater collaboration and integrated working within and across sectors. Sustainable change requires the longer-term transformation and integrated working that has been enabled by joint strategic commissioning and the integration of health and social care. The Joint Improvement Team, on behalf of our national partners, invited all partnerships to submit a summary of local progress by the end of September 2013. And this followed a similar process undertaken in 2011 and 2012. So we have a series of progress reports really since the inception of the Change Fund for Older People. The main purpose of this was to share examples of how local partnerships have developed their Change Fund to make a difference to the lives of older people and their carers across Scotland. Many examples have been submitted by partnerships are initiatives which have been tested, found to provide benefits and are now being embedded in practice. So there is evidence of some spread about particular initiatives that have been found to be of benefit. Others describe recent initiatives that are yet to be fully evaluated but are already showing some early signs of benefits. These provide valuable insight into how local partnerships have deployed their Change Fund. It has become clear that, firstly, preventative approaches are reflected across many of the pillars of the Reshaping Care for Older People's pathway and are not confined to the preventative and anticipatory care pillar alone. Secondly, we're seeing evidence that partnerships are beginning to join up interventions within a locality to amplify their impact. Thirdly, examples which describe benefits for carers were evident across all pillars of the pathway and are seen as enablers of the Reshaping Care for Older People's programme more generally. And fourthly, partnerships are developing different models of care as alternatives to admissions to hospitals and care homes. And in many cases, these are utilising the assets of all partners and providing an integrated response. There continues, however, to be some challenges in evidencing attribution and preventative supports and services. Partnerships also seek greater engagement and involvement of secondary care and acute services. And I think there's a real recognition now about the imperative to develop robust joint commissioning plans to address issues of investment and disinvestment building on work underway. We are encouraged by the shift in partnership behaviours and in the evidence from local and national outcomes and indicators that we are seeing a difference to the way health and care is being delivered across Scotland. With the focus now on strategic commissioning for older people's services and the integration of all adult services, the Change Fund has acted as an important first step in changing the way we view the design of services and how we collaborate across sectors and boundaries. We believe it has acted as a catalyst for bringing all relevant players to the table and, crucially, has seen co-production with individuals and their carers increasingly becoming the norm, normally then merely nice to do. So thank you, Convener, for the opportunity to give an opening statement, and I now welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr Wariski, and as it's your first time at committee, what will happen is I'll ask a few questions through yourself. You can either answer them yourself or they can be answered by one or more of your colleagues. And then I'll open out the session to colleagues around the table. Now, we had a wee brief chat before the session started, so you'll know very much what one of the concerns of the committee, of course, is in relation to the performance over the last 5 years in relation to the national indicator, reduce emergency admissions to hospital. Now, you have provided an excellent paper and also an appendix which shows that the average daily beds used by emergency admissions for people over the age of 65 has reduced significantly, but that there has been a general rise in the number of patients over 75 admitted, and this uses up some 5% of the entire Scottish Parliament budget, as you know. So it's I wonder if you can just explain why there hasn't been the reduction that we'd hoped to have seen in the number of patients.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I think I'm going to invite my colleague Pete Knight on my right to sort of give an initial response to that in relation to the data, but also my colleague Dr Anne Henry to maybe elaborate a little bit in terms of the service aspects of that.
Okay. Good morning. Just trying to get behind the issues here. If you look back a few years, when the Reshaping Care programme began, one of the major concerns, and it still is a major concern, to be addressed by Reshaping Care was the fact that many older people were in hospital for very, very long periods of time, and there was evidence available that suggested that in fact was not necessarily a very good situation to be, that the longer the older person was in hospital, the harder it was to actually get them out, particularly to get them back home again. So a lot of the initial focus of the Reshaping Care programme was on that issue, and that was matched up with the HEAT target, which is to reduce the rate of emergency admission bed days, which was very much focused on that particular issue of how to get people out of hospital once they're back in, once they've been admitted, because there was an acceptance that many people have to be admitted to hospital. It wasn't about putting the barriers up on the doors. It was about making sure that once we'd admitted that there was a good flow back out again, hopefully back to the person's own home again as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. More recently, however, we've become aware that for a number of factors which haven't all been fully kind of identified, that the actual people coming through the door, older people coming through the door, the admissions themselves has continued to rise, despite the quite marked change in the bed days situation, which is the third chart on the Annex B paper. Within the JIT, in terms of the improvement work, we've become, focused on this now. So this is very much now part of the JIT's interest, if you like, the emergency admissions. We have, in terms of data, we do have other data about those what might begin to explain why there's been a continuing rise in emergency admissions. For example, we now know that a disproportionate number of those extra emergency admissions are for relatively short stays. for example, I haven't shown the data in this particular sample, but we've kind of gone below the surface of these high-level data to begin to understand what the issues are. And that then we are able then to begin to see what actions we think would be necessary in order to deal with this particular trend, which is unfavourable. As you've seen in the chart there, I have the way I've presented the emergency admissions chart. I've done it on a rolling annual basis, without putting my neck on the block here and saying that perhaps we're reaching a plateau. It certainly is a more encouraging position in terms of the trends than it would have been, say, 6 months or a year ago. Happily pass over to Anne, perhaps, to follow up on some of the detail.
Yeah, surely, thanks very much. If we rewind to, I think it was October 2008, we had quite a large consensus conference event with health and social care partners across Scotland. And one of the challenges that we faced was that an ambition to reduce emergency admissions for older people, but not matched by a heat target to reduce emergency admissions at all ages, was being perceived by practitioners, but also arguably by the public, as being intrinsically ageist. What we really wanted to do was reduce inappropriate emergency admissions to hospital, but that's very difficult to measure as a national target. So we emerged from that consensus conversation dialogue with the service that actually what we wanted to do was have a sharper focus on the rate of emergency bed days spent in hospital as a consequence of an emergency admission. So in fact you're kind of getting the compound both of the emergency admissions and an inappropriately long length of stay. When we did that, it just changed the climate in terms of the service. People bought into that. The over 75 emergency bed days target, my clinical community believes in, they get behind, and that, as you can see, the graph showing the difference in the emergency bed day rate, a 10% reduction achieved in 3 years. When I talk about that across the UK and in Europe, they are staggered. So I think we need to be careful that we are focusing on the right measure, and remember that, as Pete said, that the 0 to 1 day lengths of stay, which undoubtedly have gone up, some of that is about inappropriate, avoidable admissions who, if the right care and support had been rapidly available when the GP makes the phone call, they could have been kept at home. But equally a significant proportion are people with chest pain, with an acute exacerbation of respiratory disease, where actually they need access to rapid diagnostics, which they can't have at home. And in a preventative ethos, it's far better to have 1 or 2 0 or 1 day emergency admissions with somebody who has a minor stroke or a mini stroke than having 1 6 weeks life-changing admission as a result of a very major stroke. So I think we have to be quite nuanced in the way we look at this particular target. And I'm certainly very encouraged over the last, I would say probably over the last 9 months in particular, that now we're beginning to grow the menu of alternatives to emergency admission, what we describe as intermediate care services in and across Scotland. Most localities now are starting to enhance the menu of those hospital-at-home type of alternatives to emergency admission.
Thank you very much for that. However, the national indicator, as I pointed out, said it talks about reducing the emergency admissions to hospital, not just about the number of bed days.
National outcome indicator in the performance framework, absolutely. The global one is looking at all age emergency admissions. Sitting below that is, of course, the heat target for over 75 bed days, and the other relevant heat target is the delayed discharge target as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to something slightly different. The Coalition of Care and Support Providers in Scotland expressed concern and evidence to the Health and Sports Committee that, and I quote, "Some of the Change Fund has been used to fund short-term preventive interventions, so once the Change Fund stops, so will they. The Change Fund was supposed to be a kind of lever to shift the bulk of spending that was behind it. It has in fact been used in creative ways, but almost always as an isolated project fund." We've talked about progress here in terms of the average number of daily beds, for example. No doubt there's progress elsewhere, which we'll probably go into in terms of this session. But what concerns do you have that, that this good work will actually last beyond the change funds themselves?
Okay, I'll start with that. I'll maybe ask my colleague Jerry to come in, and if other colleagues want to add to that. I think it's a very sort of good question and observation. And I think, as I described at the beginning, the Change Fund was very much not set up in isolation as an end to itself. In the very first set of Change Fund guidance, the objective about partnerships developing robust, long-term joint strategic commissioning plans was one of the objectives. And we have worked with all sectors and with local partnerships to build some of the capacity and capability required to do that. Because, as was pointed out, I think, in the early years discussion, it's something like 1 to 2% of the total spend on older people is represented by the Change Fund. So I think the key objective here is how do we use the Change Fund to be able to access that wider resource and redesign that resource. So really from day one, the Change Fund was set in that context of partnerships being supported to work on the bigger strategic planning, and that is progressing relatively well across Scotland. We recognise there was quite a lot of work and development to do, so we have invested with Scottish Government funding in a programme of development and training with partnerships to support that. I think the work that we have supported through our improvement network is also trying to ensure that we are capturing early information and examples of improvement to share. And while everything can't transfer exactly from one locality to another, it's how do we ensure that we can pull out the learning, also pull out the challenges in terms of what's not working very well, and inform the rest of Scotland. So I think that's a big focus. So this opportunity for partnerships to develop the bigger picture, I think, will in part at least address some of the concerns that the Coalition of Carers in Scotland had raised. But we also recognise that it is important that there is that sort of continued focus on the funding, where it's going, what the sustainability is. And you will have noticed in our current review of the change plans, we asked this year for the first time about evidencing spread and how initiatives were being mainstreamed. So again, a very important focus that we keep that at the forefront. But I'll ask Jerry to come in with any particular additional points.
These are concerns that aren't a surprise to me. I think that traditionally the third sector have been funded on the basis of very short-term grants, and I think that there is a legacy of concern of that continuing. However, what I would say is that my experience of being involved, I came into the JIT right at the start of this process, and certainly the influence and the confidence that has built up around local partnerships, particularly within the third sector, being a full partner in determining how services should be developed in future, has gone from a standing start where they found it difficult to influence the process to one where they are seen by all partners as central to decision making in terms of how services go forward. So I think that in terms of the bigger picture of how the third sector are able to influence the continuation of service models, I think that has changed significantly, and that will continue regardless of whether the Change Fund comes or goes or how funding takes place. As Margaret said, the idea here is not about the £300 million Change Fund. That was a catalyst to actually influence the £4.5 billion of health and social care services. So I think that the greatest achievement in many ways that I have seen is the influence that the third sector have in actually influencing that greater picture. And that I don't personally think that that will simply stop because the Change Fund comes to an end. I think that influence will continue and grow stronger. On Monday, I was at a meeting between the Edinburgh and Glasgow partnerships. It was a shared learning event. And I think that one of the things that came out from both partnerships, who started from very different starting points in terms of working together, was how influential the whole Change Fund process had been in bringing those partners together to help influence. So I think going forward, I have confidence that the third sector will be able to continue to influence the bigger picture, and that's actually something that needs to be seen from that perspective.
Okay, thank you very much for that. In terms of your report, you say that partnerships provided 234 examples that offer valuable insight into how the Change Fund has been used to make a difference to the lives of older people and their carers across Scotland. I'm just wondering if you can touch on a couple of these for us.
Yeah, just by way of process, I mean, I think it's a challenge trying to extract lots of examples, but we are working on developing a number of shorter publications to support the overview progress report that will allow thematic areas to be drawn down. But I'll ask Anne to maybe provide a few specific examples on that.
We'd invited partnerships to describe up to 5 examples of practice and to have at least one of them from each of the pillars of the pathway, which is just a tool to get them to focus not just on one part of the life stage or the setting of care. The types of examples that they've described are around anticipatory care planning, where now not just community nursing teams and social work practitioners are thinking about those thinking ahead plans to help people plan for what they might want to do or to be done with them at the point of a crisis, but also primary care. GPs are now part of the QOF that we're working with GPs. So anticipatory care planning is now being rolled out across Scotland. Examples of that are evident in, we have a little publication, a DVD, which I'm happy to leave with you, which shows the impact on people and their families of those anticipatory care planning conversations. In the last 12 months, you'll have another 40,000 people having the opportunity to have those anticipatory care plans, and the information contained in those plans shared electronically, automatically with emergency services, so that the right things happen if they have to use those emergency services like NHS 24 or the ambulance in the middle of the night when their usual care manager is not available. Examples like intermediate care, like the introduction and the rollout of a reablement approach to care and support at home, so that partnerships like, I'm thinking about South Lanarkshire partnership, where reablement is now being embedded in the way that the care and support teams at home are doing their business. Linked with that are the introduction of more integrated care and support services at home, such as the Integrated Community Support Team in South Lanarkshire, Dumfries and Galloway's Integrated Hub. You've got the North, South and East Ayrshire's Community Ward teams that are now providing that integrated health and social care support wrapped around a particular locality that's making a difference in terms of supporting people to remain at home. Other examples I would point to would be telehealth care, where we're moving from perhaps a pilot of doing telehealth to 20 people with COPD to doing that where we're working with a collection of 7 partnerships across the Ayrshires, the Lanarkshires, East Renfrewshire and Renfrewshire to help them to scale that up and take that to an ambitious level of 10,000 users by 2015. So that's just a sort of selection of some of the types of examples of practice that have been shared and that people are working together across the country. Very similar to what CMO described as their collaborative model, but what we tend to have is a whole series of almost mini collaboratives that are working together around specific topics.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to ask one more question before opening out the session to colleagues around the table. A lot of other committees obviously feed into the Finance Committee in terms of draft report, and the Local Government and Regeneration Committee said, and I quote, that we remain to be convinced the delivery of the preventive spending agenda is keeping pace with the ever-growing demographic pressure local authorities are facing. And I'm just wondering if you can give us your view on that.
I mean, I think that the sort of opportunity and challenges around our demography are well known, and I think the focus on the increasing ageing population, we have to also look at that as providing assets as well as providing a requirement for services. I think some of the information that Pete referred to earlier, which was looking at projecting forward, when we had started the Reshaping Care engagement exercise with leaders across Scotland, there was a projection around, if we continued to do what we do, where are we likely to be in 3 or 4 years' time. And at that point, we were projecting that we would require a new district general hospital to be built every 3 years, we'd require a new care home to be built every 2 weeks, etc. So I think what we've been able to evidence over the piece, which has probably been part of the work done in advance of Reshaping Care through the Long-Term Conditions Collaborative and Shifting the Balance of Care, has seen a redirection, I think, of the activity of people. So the locus of support has shifted for some. We've also seen a levelling off of the numbers of people going into a care home on a long-term basis. So again, if we were keeping with demography, we would have had to see a significant growth in care home capacity. In fact, the actual number of residents is slightly less than we had a number of years ago. So there is some evidence of those shifts. I suppose one of the challenges that we need to address is a shift in workforce. So you can shift location of care and support, but the big opportunity is around how do we shift the workforce. And again, I suppose some of the work that we did a number of years ago in mental health and learning disability, which saw a very significant redesign from institutional to much more upstream supportive services around people's lives and how they wanted to live. I think there's some learning from that. But again, I'll see if Pete has anything to add in around that challenge around the demography and the shift to prevention.
I mean, we do obviously acknowledge the demographic shifts were quite strong, and that first chart in the annex again was just to constantly remind us that that's the background in terms of the changing profile of Scotland. However, as Margaret's mentioned, the second chart there on care homes illustrates this point that change has been underway for some time, particularly in local authorities. Whether we can answer directly the question you've asked is a kind of moot point. But what we can see are a number of distinct trends beginning to. And another trend, for example, involving local authorities is where the adoption of reablement, where in local authorities, whether it's prevention or whether it's avoiding, the intention of reablement is to try to avoid people becoming dependent on services in advance of their really genuinely needing those services. And local authorities are kind of addressing some of those issues in that way, and we're beginning to see, I haven't put any evidence about home care in this particular example, but we're beginning to see a reduction in the amounts of home care being delivered.
There are a lot of examples and really quite a lot of energy around the health and well-being and social inclusion, connectedness, physical activity area as well. I was listening to CMO make reference to physical activity and diet. So a number, well, very many of the partnerships are really quite active in supporting physical activity. So, for example, Aberdeen ran their Golden Games earlier this year. Other partnerships are particularly looking at promoting physical activity in housing settings, in sheltered housing and in care home settings. And we've been working quite closely with Health Scotland around how we can provide some support and guidance for partnerships who want to do that sort of activity. We've also been working with the Older People's Assembly around that, and with a number of some of the older people advocacy groups. Seniors Together in South Lanarkshire is quite a good example of that partnership that we've had. And it's probably over a year ago now, might be even longer, then two of your colleagues, Stuart Maxwell and Richard Simpson, hosted a celebration of active ageing, or Path to Active Ageing, in Holyrood in Parliament, and we had the Musical Minds, the Dementia Choir came and performed at that. So what we're keen to do is to keep a focus on that aspect of prevention, but to do that in partnership with, obviously, with our colleagues in public health and sport. And not to lose a chance of the Commonwealth Games legacy also being relevant to this age group.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I'm now going to open out the session. The first person to ask questions will be Malcolm, to be followed by John.
I mean, it was really interesting what you said about emergency ambitions, because in a kind of way that's become the indicator of whether there's progress on this agenda. And in a kind of way, this agenda has been around for a long time, and people have been talking about the words that you've used, continuous, integrated, anticipatory care in the community, for a long time. For example, it was really the central recommendation of the Kerr report 10 years ago. So I suppose, I think there is a lot of good work going on, but it's almost being discounted because everyone's focusing on the emergency admissions indicator. So are there other indicators that could be used? Or does the government need to sort out this indicator? Because there seems to be a contradiction between what it says in Scotland Reforms and what it says in the Health Department. And I mean, Dr. Henry said, you know, there are inappropriate admissions. Is it possible to quantify, you know, the extent of inappropriate admissions and then accept that the other admissions are not going to reduce, not least because of demography?
It's certainly possible to get to that kind of detail at a local level. And partnerships are taking that kind of deeper dive. So part of their local improvement measures and metrics will be having that level of scrutiny and challenge around their admissions. So, for example, one partnership that I was working with looked at every emergency admission over the age of 65 across all of their hospitals for a week in great detail, and could tell you robustly which ones were avoidable and which were not. You're never going to be able to get that level of reliable judgment at a national level. Even some of the measures that are used internationally, like ambulatory care sensitive conditions, you may have heard that, very difficult when you look at that on a case-by-case basis to say that actually everyone who has asthma or COPD has an ambulatory care sensitive condition where their episode was avoidable. So I think it's great to have that ambition to reduce, but I would argue all age emergency admissions, not just older people, but that the target which sits below that can be much more focused on the reducing the admissions and the bed days that are a consequence of the admission. And I think that's where we've got the traction. The next level of ambition is to see, can we grow the kinds of hospital at home alternatives where consultant geriatrician, nurse practitioners, AHP practitioners are not actually in the hospital, they're actually in the community, responding within hours to a crisis and providing the kind of treatments that one would get in the hospital in your own home. Can we grow those at scale across Scotland? We have them now alive and flourishing in Lanarkshire, in Fife, in some parts of Lothian. I'm working with another a couple of boards who are at the point of trying to commission those. But as Margaret said earlier, we need to learn from what worked well around mental health moving to the community, but also be careful of what didn't work well or has caused some difficulties where it's now actually easier for a GP to get hold of a psychiatrist than it is for a consultant in hospital because they don't physically have a footprint there. We absolutely need to make sure that specialists for older people have a footprint both in the community and in hospital.
I mean, it's obviously related to the question of disinvestment, and there's been a lot of discussion on this with the joint working bill because, you know, a lot of people, particularly perhaps from local authorities in that bill, are envisaging a massive transfer of resources from the acute sector to the community. But I mean, how realistic is that in terms of, we do need extra resources to develop the services in the community that you're describing, but, you know, given what you've said about, you know, people's unrealistic expectations around emergency admissions, I mean, how realistic is it to expect that acute service budgets can be significantly reduced in order to pay for that?
I think I'm optimistic. I think how I would start is by describing it that not all beds which are operationally managed and within an acute hospital's budget are delivering acute care and interventions. Some acute hospitals or acute sector, acute divisions are also supporting hospitals which are off-site. They're in a local community. They don't have on-site medical staff. They don't have on-site diagnostics. Therefore, those are the kinds of community-based facilities that are ripe for a redesign and a considered decision through joint commissioning about the benefits of that capacity, that facility, and in fact the opportunities to reinvest the resources and the workforce wrapped around those beds into support for people to remain at home. That's actually happening gradually, incrementally across Scotland. I think, as Margaret described earlier, that's a challenge to actually take that to the next level through joint commissioning and making some quite hard local decisions. I think in terms of numbers, an example of that would be that currently in Scotland there are, I think it's of the order of over 300 people who are delayed in hospital over 2 weeks. Now, the vast majority of those individuals are not sitting in an acute district general hospital, but they are in a hospital bed, which, as I've described, doesn't have on-site doctors, doesn't have those sorts of facilities. So I think that's a good place to start. And the target around reducing delays over 2 weeks by 2015 is a good place to focus our partnerships in terms of disinvestment and reinvestment.
So, I mean, I suppose, so obviously delayed discharge is a good example, but there are other ways in which we can influence the hospital spend. But I mean, I suppose what I'm saying is disinvestment possible given the demography? Because whatever gains that we make in terms of reprovisioning in the community, is that always countered by the demography that faces us in the next few years? So, is there actually any realistic prospect of actually reducing acute budgets, say, in the next decade?
You can start, yeah.
One of the reasons why the 2020 vision and the route map to the 2020 vision has a priority around multiple morbidity or multiple and chronic illnesses is because there's a recognition that we are making some progress and traction around the reshaping care for older people ambition. You heard earlier about the work in early years, but there's a very large cohort of adults under 65, working age, adults with multiple physical and mental health conditions. Think about alcohol, obesity, mental illness that are causing that drive in terms of the trend in emergency admissions at all ages. So we recognise that we need to be doing this piece of work in tandem with some quite significant changes in the way we address adults with multiple conditions, particularly in areas of deprivation where people experience multiple physical and mental health conditions about 10 years earlier than they would in the more affluent parts of Scotland. So it is a challenge, given the demography not just of older people, it's a challenge because of the consequences of demography and the healthy life expectancy that we have at the moment. So we really need to go much further upstream in terms of what do we need to do differently with our population in their 40s and 50s to start getting a grip on this if we're taking a long game.
Okay, I suppose my last point is, well, maybe it's 2 points. I mean, to what extent, what's going to drive the changes? And I suppose that's related to what extent is the variation at the moment? I mean, you don't need to name areas of Scotland, but there must be great variations, and some must be doing a lot better than others. So taking account of that, what is going to drive progress across Scotland? I mean, is it, for example, the bill? Presumably that will help, the joint working bill, or is it going to be you? Or what's going to drive the changes, and how do we get rid of the variations in the sense that everybody at least is making good progress, although some will obviously be outstanding, whatever situation we have?
I think the bill will be enabling. I mean, I think we've had the opportunity to develop more integrated ways of working for many years, and there are one or two areas who've taken that forward in a more significant way. But I think the bill will give that mandatory legislative requirement around integration. I think what drives it is probably a number of things. I mean, I think we talked in the early years around leadership and the importance of clarity around the direction of travel, and ensuring that there is high-level leadership and engagement, as well as building that capacity throughout the organisations and across sectors. I think our view would be that the Change Fund and the Reshaping Care programme is providing a very good foundation for the work going forward in health and social care integration, because in fact it's been, I suppose, shadowing the integration and the way partnerships have been working. The point about variability, I think, is an important one, and I think what we've been encouraging partnerships to do through support of the Community Care Benchmarking Network and other ways is to use information and data to help those conversations around the table and to set the improvement targets for the partnership. And again, we have seen more evidence of the use of data and analysis of data being incorporated into the way people are now making decisions around their change plans, because we have variability. I mean, I think there's this balance of what is expected variability because of slightly differences in populations and context, but what was the unexplained variability. If you've got, you're 10 times more likely to be admitted to a hospital if you're living in one locality within one GP practice than you are a few miles down the road. So I think there is that challenge which the integrated resource framework in terms of gathering the financial information around that has helped. But I'll ask Pete maybe to come in, particularly on the benchmarking.
Just on that last point, some of the work we do, I mean, the charts that we've got in this paper are all Scotland-wide, but we've the sentinel measure that Mr. Chisholm's identified as the the emergency bed days as being kind of one that we tend to focus on, because there's lots of things wrap around that. It's being the largest spend, being the kind of what happens next after the person's been admitted, where do they go? So we've, for example, we've issued in conferences to partnerships across Scotland similar trend data for each of the different partnerships, and that allows, and even in the process of doing that, having sat around a table where people noticed it on the table in front of them, you could see immediately people wanted to see where they were relative to their peer areas. So part of this is really just about getting a kind of an awareness across the country of a kind of natural benchmarking that goes on, and getting that awareness at different levels within the organisation. The other thing I would say is, and it kind of answers part of your earlier question, which is that the challenge ahead is a little bit unknown, because we really don't know how people are going to be in the future. I mean, the future is always uncertain. Harry Burns did mention about the issue about obesity, so that's a kind of one that, you know, that could make us think that perhaps the gains in healthcare in the future might begin to worsen rather than get better in the future if we don't resolve that. However, we are trying to get improvements in the information we have, and I think that the work that the Information Services Division is doing, particularly with the IRF and the linkage of health service data and social work data in the future, I think will allow us to develop new ways of looking at the information and helping partnerships to identify the issues that they can improve around, so that they'll be able to see that variation on benchmarking, but it'll be much more than the relatively crude measures that we have at the moment, emergency bed days, care home admission. It'll be nuanced, there'll be the capability of doing analysis of what's behind that for a local area. So I'm kind of more optimistic that we will have more of the tools available to us, you know, over the next possibly 2 or 3 years.
Just another point. I mean, I think in terms of what's making a difference, Jerry alluded to it in one of his comments, which is around building that capacity for the co-production of the way we are designing and delivery services. And I think the real engagement, and it hasn't been without its challenges in some areas, but the real engagement of third sector colleagues and independent care sector colleagues in the discussions around the redesign and what will take us forward in terms of that vision and the outcomes for people, I think again has brought some of that cultural shift that I know is referred to in your report. It's not, you know, just about the money, and it's not just about, you know, the way we structure things. It's actually quite a significant cultural aspect. So I don't think we should underestimate that, and we need to ensure that we keep our focus on supporting that going forward.
John, to be followed by Jean.
Thank you. Yes, maybe to follow on some of the things that was mentioned there, especially the whole area of partnership. And I mean, I think a lot of us, when we think about this area, we're thinking primarily NHS and we're thinking local councils. But there's already been other bodies mentioned out there, and I think, Dr. Horsky, you mentioned housing in your opening remarks. But we have had evidence or witnesses from the housing sector, both public and private and third sector, that they do feel left out, and they don't feel that they're involved in this, but they do feel the actual house that somebody lives in is a big factor in a lot of these things we're talking about. So how do you see housing fitting into all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Joint Improvement Team really from its inception in 2004-05 actually had housing as part of our focus, but recognising, I think, as the work has evolved with health and social care partnerships, housing hasn't been at the table in the way that housing should be. So we have, I suppose, actively been working with our housing colleagues and in terms of trying to build some of that capacity. I suppose a practical example, in terms of the work that partnerships were tasked with in developing their first joint commissioning plan for older people in March, April of last year. We worked with housing colleagues, both policy colleagues and government, but also our housing stakeholders, to develop what was referred to as a housing contribution statement. So it was in an effort to ensure that the Chief Housing Officer was engaged in the signing off of the joint commissioning plan. So in a sense that was a bit symbolic, but I think the practical work that's been underway over the last few years, but particularly, I suppose, over recent months and years in terms of getting the housing sector engaged nationally as well as locally. The Joint Improvement Partnership Board that I mentioned has a housing representative on the board, and I think that's hugely beneficial in terms of addressing the housing at a strategic level, but also how we support the housing at local partnership level. So I would say it's work in progress. But the housing lobby, I think, have been particularly constructive around their engagement around health and social care integration. I think we've seen some progress with regard to the work on reshaping care and the Change Fund, but I know there's an aspiration that housing is more ably reflected, I think, in the legislation and in the regulations and guidance going forward. So certainly from the JIT's perspective, I would echo the sort of concerns that have been brought to your attention, but I suppose with some degree of reassurance say that we have clocked that and are working very actively and constructively with our housing colleagues in how we can make sure that they are at the table and are contributing in a very real way to the work in local partnerships.
Level, because you can get one representative of whatever, say, housing associations. But I mean, if you go to a more local level like Glasgow, you've got private house builders, you've got a big housing association, GHA, you've got loads of small housing associations all in there. How is that just difficult in practice, do you think?
I think it is difficult in practice, and in fact, just in the last sort of number of months, we facilitated with housing the setting up of the Housing Coordinating Group, which was trying to get all the national partners around a table and have some sort of coherence around the housing sector's voice. I think we are seeing a couple of examples in some local areas where they have been trying to mirror that and actually engage with that sort of range of housing providers and stakeholders in housing. So again, I think it is a challenge, but we are, I suppose, seeing one or two areas really taking that up and looking at how they can get a representative housing voice, recognising that there are a number of stakeholders.
I mean, similarly, I wonder with the third sector too, because again at the committee we've had a little bit of a variation. I think Malcolm Chisholm touched on this. You know, at one council or one area came and told us that the third sector was at the table with them and they were discussing all of these issues together. Another council said, well, the third sector can bid for a contract, which struck me as a slightly different way of approach.
I'll maybe ask Jerry to comment on that initially.
Okay, thank you. The issue in terms of, if I understand it, is the relationship with between the third sector and partnerships. There have been some partnerships where I have heard that they have expected the third sector to actually bid for a contract, but that is in a very small number of cases. The experience I have from the vast majority of partnerships is that the third sector are seen as a full partner in planning, designing and delivering services, and it's really about who is best to deliver those services. So I think that is as an example, is probably, there are a few isolated examples of that. Certainly that is not my experience sitting around the table. As I've said, I have seen partnerships go from suspicion of the third sector, where you have 20 people sitting around the table from health, 20 from the council, and one part-time individual from the third sector who hasn't been given the papers in time and doesn't speak the language, to one where there is much better engagement. For example, one of the things that the JIT have done along with the third sector unit in government we saw the need to support third sector interfaces better engage in these partnerships, and so we invested with the Health and Social Care Alliance, the alliance in Glasgow, to develop an enhancing the role of the third sector. Doesn't trip off the tongue very well, but enhancing the role of the third sector team, who were dedicated to supporting third sector interfaces better engage with partnerships. And certainly I have seen that from my own personal experience, how that relationship has developed. So I think I have heard of those cases, but in a very small number of isolated cases has that relationship remained difficult and not really one of integrated working.
Do you folk have a role in kind of trying to roll out best practice in that area to the few remaining difficult?
Absolutely. Yes, I mean that is one of our roles, and as I've said, we've put our money where our mouth is, if you like, in terms of investing in developing assistive practices and teams which will actually support the third sector do that. And we sit as part of the steering group for that team along with the third sector unit. So if there are difficulties, they are coming through that table, both through the alliance and a number of representative third sector groups who actually, particularly the one who represent the third sector interface.
Just to add, I mean, I think the opportunity the Joint Improvement Team has is that we have a JIT lead for each of the 32 partnerships in Scotland, and that person will, to an extent, obviously not there all the time, but will sit around the partnership table and I suppose provide that conduit from the national sort of policy and expectations to the local partnerships, draw out some of the issues and challenges as well. But I think as you develop that relationship, it is that sort of constructive challenge you can also bring. So it's not that everything is cosy and all the time. It is about being able to bring that sort of constructive challenge to the partnership, but also support the partnership. So it's trying to, as I say, continue that sort of improvement journey with the partnership. But as Jerry said, I think there have been some sort of quite useful examples of how the third sector engagement has developed significantly over a relatively short period of time when the Change Fund came along coming up for 3 years ago now. But really there was a relatively early sort of time for people to begin to develop their partnership and how they're going to work. But I think a few years down the road we have seen that mature. I think it's also important that there is a bit of grit in the oyster still. So I think, it's useful within a partnership to have the respect and the confidence in working together, but also the ability for the partnership to be challenging each other as well, so that it doesn't become overly complacent.
Okay, thanks. And the third area in partnership, which has also been mentioned, is family. And I think, Dr. Henry, you mentioned that when we're talking about anticipatory care plans. I mean, I'm just wondering where we are there, because it's even more difficult to get, can one representative represent all the families in Scotland kind of thing? Probably not. Is that changing over time? I had a case recently where I think there was two sisters, both pretty high-powered, busy careers. The father in a residential home, or I think in sheltered housing actually, and their expectation of the input from the kind of public sector was quite high. Traditionally, I mean, families did take a big responsibility for their elderly relatives, even I think within society, often the Asian communities exemplary in the amount of care they put into a family. Is that changing? Is that anticipated to change?
Well, I'm sorry, I can't remember if you mentioned earlier about what are the key drivers in terms of taking this forward. Might have been Mr. Chisholm. One of the issues that we need to address, both JIT and wider than JIT in terms of government and public sector organisations, are public expectations. And I think that that's a key challenge and one of the key issues in terms of driving change forward. We have constructed over, and I speak from experience of 30 years in the health service, both as a clinician and a general manager. We were trained to deliver a service with the best possible intentions for people and to people. We have seen changes in society where perhaps things were done within families before and are not done now. I think we need to get a balance between what we should be doing within public services for people to enable them to facilitate their health and well-being, but at the same time we need to understand what those expectations are with the public. So I think there is a conversation, a debate, a change to take place to bring us to a point where we actually get that balance right. And I think perhaps we've maybe gone the other way. This is personally speaking from, as I say, from 30 years within the health service, where perhaps we have trained our workforce to deliver services to and for people, to create expectations within the public that that's what the workforce does, and that we perhaps now need to, in terms of prevention, focus on how our workforce actually enable, facilitate and support individuals, families, etc., to actually address the needs that they have. So that's maybe one of the areas that we need to address, and those expectations in terms of what the public sector will do, I think perhaps need to be debated, to be changed a bit in terms of what those expectations can be.
If that's on. Some practical examples of work that we're taking forward around that are in the Living It Up programme, sometimes described as the Dallas programme, where the emphasis is on supporting people to use day-to-day technology, social media, digital television, to get more information and advice and empower them to take more control. and sort of manage their life, their conditions, get more connected and involved. And also the work that Jerry and colleagues are leading around co-production, working with partnerships and indeed some local authorities. It's going local authority wide in terms of implementing that ethos.
Themselves, but the wider family group, yes.
And another example would be the use of family group conferencing for people affected by dementia, and some of our improvement work around the theme of dementia is very much grounded within that wider family network.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask, one of the things I thought was interesting in the earlier, when we were listening to evidence from early years and the Minister, was, and I think everybody made a note of the meeting with 700 or 800 people in a room getting really excited about, you know, how they could actually influence some of the work practices that they do and to improve things. Do you do that?
Well, we have, I think I mentioned we established an improvement network which was initially sort of around the Reshaping Care for Older People programme, but now extending to support health and social care integration. And I think the network is a network of all partnerships across Scotland and key stakeholders to facilitate that cross-sector collaborative learning. And I think there's a range of activities that we do. We don't do I haven't done to date maybe the big 800 collaborative type approach, but we will have a range of national events, we will have regional events. We increasingly are trying to engage people through our WebEx sessions, so there's the opportunity to engage people where they're able to sit in their own office but also get involved through a range of, I suppose, developing sort of practice guidelines and case studies. So I think we probably focus on trying to share the learning and improvement and links through both some national work but also some regional and local networking as well. But Anne, do you want to comment, because you've been involved in a number of the collaboratives?
Yeah, in 2008 I led work on the Long-Term Conditions Collaborative. We used a very similar model to the one that Sir Harry described earlier, but we learned quite early on that for complex whole system change in the community, the sort of model that works, a breakthrough collaborative series where you get 700-800 people in a room 2 or 3 times a year, just wasn't necessarily what was landing best for partnerships who are also engaged in other types of collaboratives and learning events. So the feedback from partnerships during that process was, give us more themed learning events where we come together, maybe a couple of 100 or 100 people, much more interactive, maybe some more local, give us some virtual learning events for the island boards who really don't want to have to fly down to come to the SECC. So we have the same approach, but we've modified it over the years from feedback from partnerships, and we ask every event, every learning and improvement event we do, we get feedback from partnerships about what worked, what didn't work, what do you want to see the next time. And we really build our programme of learning events on that. And all of our learning events are done in partnership with other improvement organisations. So it's not just the joint improvement team. We have a collaboration of improvement organisations, including the Improvement Service, Healthcare Improvement Scotland, NHS Education, the Care Inspectorate. So all of our collaborative learning events are truly sort of collaborative products.
Could I just add that, just building on what Anne said in terms of collaborating with other areas that are producing this, the Person-Centred Health Collaborative, which has been taken forward by the Quality Unit, has a very distinctive people-powered health and well-being element, which focuses on co-production, which has been led by the Alliance. And we're very much involved in developing that with them. And that is one of these big breakthrough 700 events. However, it's also important to say that, you know, from JIT, we have run 2 national conferences on co-production where we've had over 400 people either attend or link into that. We'll have another one in April. We have established, along with SCDC, the Scottish Centre for Community Development, the Scottish Co-Production Network, which is 400 members who share information, etc. We've distributed over 6,000 copies of this book, which is about co-production. So, in a sense, there are a number of ways in which we actually link people together, where we actually send out good practice through the website, etc. And we do link into other aspects of work that Scottish Government is taking place to ensure that they tie in with relevant parts of that agenda.
Just to round that off, I'm just doing reflecting back since October around one topic, the intermediate care, the alternatives to hospital admission and supported discharge and anticipatory care planning work. I've been in a room with probably 600 people from across Scotland, but I've not been in the one room. We've had an event in Dundee, an event in Kilmarnock, an event in Edinburgh, and then an event in Fife between October, November and December. So we're reaching and keeping the energy going, but not always in that kind of 3 or 4 times a year basis.
I mean, one of my reasons for raising that was, I think, twofold, really, that I represent an area that's the most rural part of Scotland, from Shetland to the Mull of Kintyre, and I've met with a number of particularly organisations, perhaps in the third sector, who find, some of whom are doing, I think, really extraordinary and innovative work. And I think I've met frustration that they're not kind of part of the mainstream or how they can influence things. So that was my reason for asking, so thank you about that. The other thing was, that came up was a change in how they might be funded, or how their relationships with the other agencies. And I wonder if you have a comment about that.
Are you meaning the third sector?
The third sector
organisations?
Yeah. And access to the Change Fund and review of the work that they're doing.
I mean, I think in terms of going forward, the work that partnerships are engaged in around joint strategic commissioning is very much around a partnership. It's not just the statutory sectors sitting in a room deciding how they're going to plan and use the resource. As a building on the experience of the Change Fund, third sector and also independent care sector, who provide a huge amount of care and support across Scotland, are engaged in those discussions and in the decisions about the funding. So I think in relation to the Change Fund itself, we have moved from a point at the beginning where I think people were beginning to look at how they work together, what was the relative, and I'm using the term in italics here, voting powers, if you like, of the different sectors, to I think a building of trust and recognition of what the sectors and parties bring to the table, to a more shared understanding. So I think there are a number of examples where there's a very collective approach taken to decisions around the funding, and the third sector voice, should be as strong at that table than the statutory sector voices. And as I say, we are working hard with our third sector colleagues and independent sector colleagues to ensure that that capacity and capability is developed and further supported as we go into those more significant decisions around the wider resource and the joint commissioning plans. So I think it's something we always have to be mindful of and not complacent about. And I think there may be some areas in Scotland where some of the third sector people doing some excellent work are harder to reach. But it's how do we ensure that the partnership is reaching out and engaging with the stakeholders, and we can provide some support to that, but I suppose also some constructive challenge where that's required.
Okay, and just finally a question about emergency admissions. I think I'm right, I don't have figures with me, but with the introduction of NHS 24, I mean, were you aware of any increase at that time of emergency admissions, particularly the overnight and the 0-day stay, as you put it? Because certainly, again, in rural areas, there was a very different procedure that happened, and if sometimes we had doctors who were flown from Holland or France or somewhere. It was language difficulties, geography difficulties, and in case of doubt and you don't know family history and so on, it was better to send somebody in an ambulance to hospital. And that was becoming kind of common currency, and people were aware of that. And I just wonder if that had any effect on your unusual increase in that overnight stay.
Maybe ask Pete to comment on the data specifically, and if there's any other comments from the service side.
I mean, it's a possible explanation. Is probably the furthest I could go. There has been a rise in over the last 5 years in the number of people attending accident emergency departments, and there'll be a spin-off from that into actual admissions into hospital. Attributing a reason for that when there could be other reasons that people might well suggest as well makes it difficult to say yes or no to that, other than that it is a possible issue.
You did make clear that any breakdown of, in fact, you'd only looked in one area in Aberdeen or somewhere, was it, that you had analysed the figures? So I just wondered if there was any.
It's the whole of Scotland. It's quite clear that in terms of emergency admissions, the largest number of emergency admissions has in the recent past. The last 5 years has risen pretty well proportionally to the ageing of the population. That could be coincidence, or it could be a factor. However, the proportion who are admitted for very short stays, zero lengths of stay, in other words, they're admitted and discharged on the same day, or they're admitted for one night only, has risen much faster than the general, but proportionally that's a smaller group of people.
Thank you.
I think the example was one of your examples, Anne, where the partnership looked in some detail at everybody over 65 who was admitted over a week. So, Anne, have you anything to add?
Yeah. I mean, just to say that it's not just a Scottish phenomenon. This is a globally recognised issue, certainly in developed countries, and there are no single cause and effect relationship that's obvious. Greater minds than ourselves have been put to this question, and I think some changes in system access are probably contributing. Undoubtedly, some changes in clinician behaviours, and a significant change in public expectations, public behaviours and attitudes to managing risk. And it's all of that, and in a sense that's why we have an unscheduled care action plan, and all boards and partnerships are taking forward a whole set of actions across the whole system, and not just about older people.
Okay, thank you.
Gavin.
Thank you. Just a couple of very brief specifics on the change fund itself. Firstly, am I right in thinking that while the work clearly will continue, the change fund itself ends in financial year 15-16? Secondly, when it ends, does it kind of taper downwards, or is it effectively a cliff edge, if you like, where it goes to zero or close to zero? And thirdly, if it's the latter of those two, are there any risks attached to that, or in your view, will the fund have served its purpose by that point?
I'll start off with that. I mean, the Change Fund is a 4-year fund, and it went from 70 million in year 1 to 80 million year 2, 80 million year 3, and we'll go back to 70 million from April of this year as the 4th year. There is the new Integrated Care Fund that was announced as part of the spending review, and work is underway to develop the sort of guidance and principles of how that will work. I think it's important that it's not seen as year 5 of the Change Fund. So it's building on the Change Fund, but it's got a wider applicability around it. And this has been something that's been signposted to partnerships from the beginning. If you remember, the first year we only had a year, and there was a bit of nervousness around investing in any developments that might have some recurring costs for the following year until the spending review. So we did see, I think, a sort of a delay in implementation from when the money hit partnerships to actually services and initiatives starting. So my sort of sense is we're running about 6 months behind when the finances were allocated. But the work on the Joint Strategic Commissioning, which I know we've made several references to, is really key in this because, as we said, from day one, the Change Fund guidance sort of heralded the importance of partnerships thinking in the long term around sustainability and embedding those initiatives that work. There certainly are some anxieties. I think some of our third sector colleagues have expressed some anxieties about work that they're involved in with the partnership and how that will sustain. But I think the importance of focusing on the evolution to the Joint Strategic Commissioning and the opportunities around the new Integrated Care Fund, which will have, as I say, a wider reach, particularly taking account of adults with multimorbidity as well as older people, is going to be important. Pete, anything to add to? No. Okay.
That's all, Convener. Thank you.
Well, that has concluded questions from the committee. I've just got one question to finish, which is how do you think the delivery of the Change Fund could be improved?
It's always a good question, isn't it? I think we probably underestimated the start-up time to engaging partnerships in the dialogue and the conversation. So I think you could look very transactionally at a change plan and ticking the boxes and, you know, developing a number of initiatives. But I think the time that was required and the time it's taken to really develop how that culture and ways of working, probably we all collectively underestimated. So I think there were expectations in year one that were unrealistic and I think did cause some sort of pressure on partnerships. I think the evolution from a one-year fund to then a longer-term fund was really important because I think if you only have a year's fund, it does sort of encourage some of the short-termism and projectitis to that. While I'm thinking, I'm going to ask my colleagues if they've got sort of thoughts because it's probably something we've all been reflecting on. Anne?
I wonder if I could clarify the question. I'm not sure, is it the delivery of the Change Fund nationally or at a local level, its implementation? Sorry.
Well, basically implementation at local level to ensure that we get the kind of changes in culture, structure and delivery of services that we want to see.
Okay. I'm also going to go back to that joint commissioning issue because I think where I'm seeing a step change is people at the beginnings in 11-12 were seeing it as a change fund and taking a fairly narrow view. Now the conversations I'm involved with around partnership tables are about seeing the bigger picture. So I think helping partnerships manage that shift in ambition and scale to not the 1.5% but the totality of the budget is where I would focus my energy on.
Okay, thank you.
For me, it's about partnerships focusing on the wider picture and the ultimate goal, what can be achieved. The Change Fund was only 4 years, but the Reshaping Care for Older People strategy is 10 years. So this isn't something that ends after year 4. Allied to that, the public bodies joint working, particularly when you read the policy memorandum, it's quite clear about the vision that government have for the future of services within Scotland. And I think if I was to advise any partnership in terms of how they should see the Change Fund, they should see it within that wider context and continue to focus not just, as we've all said, in terms of the 300 million, but the 4.5 billion pounds. That's the great aim. So for me, that's where we have to continue focusing and reminding partnership that that's what we're trying to achieve, not simply something that's lasting 4 years.
Thank you very much. Any further points you wish to make to committee before we wind up the session?
I don't think so. I think that was really useful and sort of a range of questions which I think will help us reflect as well on our role and our contribution to this going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wariski, to you and your colleagues, actually. It's been very illuminating. Thank you. And that ends the committee session for today. So I'll now close this meeting of the Finance Committee.